So come on in. Thank you all. Good morning. Thanks for showing up early. I appreciate it. So I'm Whitney Tome, the Executive Director of Green 2.0, and on behalf of myself and the entire working group and our board, I'm delighted to have you here. We're really talking about today building power in the environmental movement and how do we do it. And we have a really wonderful panel, a set of panels for you today. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation that is building on a long time conversation that's been going on in this movement for quite a while. But first off, I'm going to start with the simple premise, which is what is our mission at Green 2.0? Walk through the program with you very quickly. I'm going to take a moment of silence for some losses that we've had in the last day, and then introduce our first speaker. So first, Green 2.0 has what sounds like a very simple mission, which is to increase the racial diversity in the environmental movement. Right? We'll be done by next week. It'll be great. But it's really a longer term process, which is how do you actually build power? How do you include everybody who needs to be involved in this movement? And how do you get them to both take jobs, but care and voice their opinions about the importance of environmental issues, from clean water, clean air, to the bees on my jacket, to everything else, because they matter, right? They matter. So it sounds simple, but complex to actually make that all happen. You have to think about everything from culture, to process, to commitment, to dedication. And how do you do all those things in this movement? And I'm really looking forward to hearing from some of our wonderful speakers about how they've been doing it, and then how we can continue to do this across the board. And when I say that, I also mean the NGOs, the foundations, and the federal government agencies who do environmental work. All of us need to work together to make this kind of change. So for the program, we have a wonderful set of opening speakers. We have Richard Revesz, former dean here at NYU Law School, and now the Lawrence King Professor of Law. Then we have Dr. Lisa Coleman, who is the inaugural Chief Diversity Officer here at NYU Law and NYU overall, and is going to speak a little bit about how NYU is doing this kind of work when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Then we have a slight change in our agenda. Mustafa Ali is unable to attend, and in part it's because he lost his father yesterday. So I'd like to take a moment of silence for him and his family, but also because one of our other panelists, Ignacia Moreno, who's here today, also lost her uncle, patriarch of her family as well, yesterday. So if you don't mind, I'd like to just take a moment to send our love and prayers to their families. So in lieu of having Mustafa, we have Robert Rabin, founder of Green 2.0, to give us some opening remarks. And then we'll move on to two panels. The first one is around the pipeline. So when you think about, all right, how do we get people into jobs, especially those C-suite jobs, we have a wonderful set of panelists, both from the NGO community and from search firms, to really talk about both the partnership that needs to happen between your search firm and yourself, but also the internal culture organizations really need to start dedicating themselves to or doing right now when it comes to building and being ready for those new leaders. And then our final panel will be really focused on how do you actually, let's assume my panel succeeds and we get all the people in the right place, what does it mean for policy, both internal policy but also environmental policy, when you have key leaders in those top jobs? And then lastly, we have some wonderful closing remarks from the New York City's Director of Sustainability, Mark Chambers, to close us out. So that's the program for today. Simple, right? Easy? Maybe not. But we're really looking forward to this, and hopefully we'll also allow you all to provide some Q&A throughout with both of the panels so that you can get some of your thoughts and questions out to this really illustrious group. So first, I want to open it up and invite Richard Revesz to give some welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Whitney. So I'm Ricky Revesz, and in addition to being on the faculty here at the law school, I direct the Institute for Policy Integrity, and the Institute is thrilled to host this event, which was organized by Green 2.0. I'd like to give a huge thanks to Robert Rabin and to Whitney Tome and to all their colleagues at Green 2.0 and at the Rabin Group for the extraordinary work they did in putting this event together. They were really spectacular partners. And I'm also hugely grateful to my policy integrity colleagues, Derek Sylvan, Dean Abdul-Hadi, and Ileana Paul, who worked very closely with the Green 2.0 team on the event. So Policy Integrity is a nonpartisan think tank dedicated to improving the quality of government decision-making, primarily in the environmental area. And we partner with a broad range of NGOs dedicated. We offer our expertise at the intersection of law, regulatory policy, and economics to help advance environmental agendas. Currently, we're very actively involved in lots of litigation over the Trump administration's illegal attempts to roll back and undermine key environmental and public health safeguards. And in particular, to the core of our work, the Trump administration in these efforts focuses on the cost savings of delays, stays, and repeals, but does not properly account for the resulting foregone benefits. Our 7 lawyers and 4 PhD economists work closely to analyze these analytical failures, and our amicus briefs on these issues have influenced a number of significant judicial decisions. We also have a strategy and communications team that has brought significant attention to these failings. Now, because policy integrity works on this broad range of environmental policy issues, and we frequently collaborate with environmental NGOs, both large and small, we view the diversity of the environmental movement as critically important to the movement's success. And there has never been a more significant time to focus on these issues. For example, this past summer, I co-authored an op-ed with Ignacia Moreno, who is here. It was published in the Los Angeles Times. Ignacia served as U.S. Assistant Attorney General for Environment and Natural Resources in the Obama administration, and you'll be hearing from her this morning. Most importantly, from my perspective, Ignacia serves on the Policy Integrity Advisory Board and chairs our litigation committee. So all these cases that are brought as a result of Ignacia's blessing. So our piece, this LA Times op-ed, looked at what I regard as a triple cruelty against Latinos and other minority populations. They're disproportionately affected by asthma and other public health negative effects as a result of our nation's failure to comply with the Clean Air Act's National Ambient Air Quality Standards. The Trump administration is compounding the problem through its healthcare rollbacks and aggressive deportation policies. So think about a parent of a young child with asthma without access to ongoing medical care who faces a dilemma about whether to take the child to an emergency room when doing so might place the family or members of the family at risk of deportation. Ignacia and I also published a Spanish version of this piece in Univision, and I did subsequent Spanish language media outreach. At NYU, both the law school and the university are making significant efforts to bring attention to the imperative for diversity and inclusion in our society. And that's why I'm so pleased that Dr. Lisa Coleman, the university's Senior Vice President for Global Inclusion, Diversity, and Strategic Innovation, and its first Chief Diversity Officer, agreed to address the conference. Lisa reports directly to the NYU president and came to the university from Harvard, where she had served as Chief Diversity Officer and assistant to the president. She also holds a PhD in American Studies from NYU, so this is a welcome back home to Lisa. So thank you so much, Lisa, for joining us today and for talking to us about the important initiatives that are underway both at the university, at the law school, and the whole NYU community. Thank you so much. It's wonderful that you're here.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to NYU. I'm so pleased to be here with you all this morning. And I'd like to thank Richard, of course, Robert Rabin and the Rabin Group, and of course, Green 2.0 for all the work that they're doing. I've had the fortune, of course, being here at NYU for 4 months. My plan, I will talk a little bit about the plan that I hope to engage as I hire a staff. Right now, I refer to my office as a startup. Until December 22nd, there was myself and a temp, and now I have one other person, so we are really in startup mode. There are a number of initiatives that we have begun here at NYU, and I'd also like to thank here at the law school, the Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, which was, of course, founded by Kenji and others, and for their work that they're doing here at the law school. People have asked me about my experience thus far at NYU and about these 4 months. And what I can say is that it's been an amazing experience, and I again find myself in a room full of people committed to the very things to which I remain. I hope that we all remain committed to the intersections of diversity, equity, inclusion that are central to our collective future. As all of you know, there are leaky pipelines, pathways, difficulties in our pathways to increase diversity, particularly in leadership positions across all sectors. And we see this of course, in the environmental justice movement, as well as legal sectors, higher education, and corporate sectors as well. Of course, in this particular case, this has been pointed out by Dr. Dorcetta Taylor's report, in which she highlights the particular difficulties in this arena. As Richard has already pointed out, there's never been a time more important for us to think about the work that we need to do together and how we might do this to sustain our futures. When I think about the work of environmental sustainability and diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity, what I know is that our lives are intertwined and intermingled. And I am so pleased to be here to hear from this collection of individuals, because I think the panelists will provide us with some insights that will help us think about what our next steps might be. When I was thinking about giving this talk, I was thinking about how we might think about what it means for our environment and our human lives to be combined. It is true that we will erode or thrive together. We will sink like the polar bears or reduce monoxides and toxins in drilling. We will drown or we will fish together. Our lives will be destroyed or not, and we must think about this and leverage the diversity of our minds, of our representational bodies, our collective cities, and of course specific locales. I think about the wolves that were released into Yellowstone Park, changing the ecosystem, and the scientists that made that innovation and had that idea some years ago in 1995, and thus we have seen the rapid change, and we must be as innovative in our work. So when people ask me about this platform of diversity and equity, of inclusion, I was recently in New Zealand, where the topography and the geography is changing dramatically. The migratory patterns of New Zealand, for those of you who are unfamiliar, New Zealand is a population that used to be mostly about 90% of German, Dutch, etc., Anglo ancestry. It is now a population of over 60% persons of color migrating, the Maori people, of course, the indigenous populations, and then migrations from Indonesia, Malaysia, and other parts of the world. We are seeing topography changes, geographical changes, and we must deal with our realities and the futures that face us and are pressing. So for me, this work is about what we do both at the macro and micro levels. I bring up places like New Zealand because we must be specific to the locations in which we exist and do this work, and we must be specific in the diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity work. One of the pleasures of being here at NYU is that I get to work across the multiplicity of schools. I get to work in the law school, or the School of Nursing, or with our Steinhardt School. I had the pleasure when I was at Harvard to work with the School of Design. And working across these different schools and sectors allows me to think about diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity, and what that looks like in those different spheres. And I want to, again, say what I'm so pleased about today is that this is a specific address to the issues that are pertinent in environmental in the work of environmental justice, and of course, building power in that movement. So in a nutshell, what is my work about? It is about the bottom line, of course, of higher education, which is about knowledge production. Sometimes I ask that question, what is the bottom line in higher education? I get a lot of different answers. I would like to suggest that our bottom line is the production of knowledge. And we produce that knowledge through a variety of ways. We produce it through research and teaching, we produce it through faculty and student engagement, and we produce it through external and internal outreach and programs, that would include alumni relations, et cetera. And yesterday I had the great pleasure of hearing Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg speak, actually right here at the law school. And in her talk, she talked a lot about what it means to build diverse communities and what it means to work across difference. In fact, she talked a lot about, as many of you are probably familiar, her friendship with Scalia and what that looked like over time. And again, it was brought to my attention that we must come across our differences and speak across our differences to build a better tomorrow. So for me, diversity is about cognitive diversity, which of course is about the ways we think, and I encourage you to look at the work of Lyra Borodsky out of the University of Southern California, where she actually talks about the relationships between mind, world, and language and the ways in which we learn cognitively to form who we are. And that is very much related to who we are in terms of our backgrounds, racial, gender, age, religion, etc. And if we leverage these, that is the way in which we can build our collective futures, because indeed it is from the site of diversity that incubation and innovation are built. Lastly, because I know I'm running close to my 10 minutes, I think about this a lot. Our president of the university is a chemist. And I started off in computer science. My mother was a computer scientist, and I was raised by scientists. In fact, I say this, I didn't know there was a problem with science and people of color because I was raised by scientists. They were all around me. I had to run away to the humanities. Andy Hamilton, our president, is a chemist, and I've come to think a lot about atoms and how atoms are, of course, made and formed. And of course, what we need is atoms to come together. Not atom like A-D-A-M, it's atom, A-T-O-M, and those form complex compounds. And what we need are complex solutions from complex people to solve the problems of today and tomorrow. I am in the business of higher education because this is where we form minds, where we have people and bring speakers to help educate. And this is the kind of world that I want to be in because we expand incubation, innovation, diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity. Thank you for being with us here today. I wish I could stay for the entire day. Of course, I've only been here 4 months, and I have one other person working with me, so I have to actually present 4 other places today. But I want to thank you very much, and I hope that everything goes well today, and I look forward to hearing back from the leaders and hearing about the panels. Again, thank you very much.
Some wonderful remarks, Dr. Coleman. Thank you so much. I think you really highlighted a few of the really important issues for the rest of the day. Specificity, working across difference, and the complexity of these problems and the complexity of the people. So I really would like to continue to highlight those throughout the day, so thank you. So I get the privilege of introducing Robert Rabin, a man on a mission, or at least many missions, perhaps. But Robert founded Green 2.0, but also the Rabin Group, and really thought about how do you create this sort of world that we're looking for in the environmental movement in a little microcosm of what I'd call the Rabin Group, of how you build with women, people of color, LGBTQ folks, a organization that really is devoted to this. And then spurring on that, created and founded Green 2.0. And I'd like Robert to give a few remarks around sort of both the founding of Green 2.0, but also its genesis and then its expansion over time. Robert.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. I actually deeply regret having to speak today. The circumstances, as you heard from Whitney about Mustafa Ali and his family, send my condolences to that. So you're stuck with me. It's extremely exciting to be back at NYU. I'm a graduate of this law school where I feel like I got my life. My children would dispute that. They don't think I ever got a life, but I got my life here. It was really, really awesome to be at a place that was interested in using the law as for what I thought was a progressive tool. I didn't exactly know what that meant when I was here, but having worked in Congress and in the Clinton administration running a division of the Department of Justice and dealing with the man every single day, I know exactly how important it is that we understand how law is a tool to move social change. So I'm so, so grateful that I went here and that I'm back. Thank you, Dean Revesz, who was a teacher of mine, for your inspiration and for working today to put this together. I'm excited that my other NYU colleague, Ignacio Moreno, is here to share this day. One other shout out is to Eric Pica, whose leadership at Friends of the Earth and frankly on behalf of all of the president's leaders of the major environmental groups on the topic that we're discussing today, which is the status of people of color, has been invaluable. So thank you so much. A little bit about the status of people of color. The Raven Group is an unusual organization because I run it, and I'm unusual. We're a private sector firm, but I am devoted. My employees are free to have a different point of view on this, but we are devoted to shifting power to women and people of color. The disabled, LGBT, other groups that haven't and continue not to get a fair shake. It's an unusual market position for a private sector firm. So we are busier than we are lucrative. The more I work on shifting power to women and people of color, the angrier I get. My father, who's deceased, promised me the opposite. As I got more successful and wealthier, I'd get more and more conservative, and he was wrong. He was a wonderful man, but he was wrong on that score. The closer I get to the epicenter of power, the more I see how messed up the system is and how important it is for people who care to shift to be organized and focused. So we try to do that from the private sector. There's two interrelated problems. One is a moral problem and one is an operationalized problem. The moral problem around the lack of inclusion for women and people of color is pretty significant in the United States. We're making tremendous progress. As you lawyers say, arguendo. We have an enormous way to go. The racism and the sexism is preternatural, and it requires more and more successful people to say that and to not cower. There is a structural component, and there is a sort of emotional component. In 2007, 2008, we have a, quote, financial collapse. We actually have a Wall Street collapse. And the devastation across the country and across the world is off the charts, particularly for people of color. The New York Times, which remains an excellent publication in my view, doing tremendous work, put out a 2-page spread, probably in 2009. Dr. Coleman, I know you're leaving, but I'm going to mention NYU in a second. So if you can hover by the door, I want you to hear it in your 4-month tenure. The New York Times puts a chart out of the 50 people most influential in bringing us this collapse: bank presidents, hedge funds, equity funds, da-da-da-da. Of the 50 people, 47 are men, 47 are white or Jewish. The 3 who are women are all government regulators who tried to prevent the collapse. The 3 who are people of color, one of whom is a government regulator, the other 2 happen to be presidents of banks. So 47 of the 50 who are complicit are white men, but there isn't a national outcry about the ineptitude of white men. There isn't a sense that, gee, we tried with white men, let's try something else. So this is an emotional problem. When one Latina screws up somewhere, we have the fungible Latina problem. Well, we tried with Carmencita. I don't know that we should go that route again. So these are structural and racist barriers that play out over and over and over again. The third sort of moral piece is the enormous amount of energy put into problematizing the solution. Those of us who want to fix it come up with different formulae or attempts to bring women and people of color. Dr. Coleman, I'm sorry, I promised you the NYU example. Another campaign that we run at the Raven Group is to shift asset management to women and people of color. There are $71 trillion in assets in the United States. Your pension money, corporate treasury, municipal foundation, university endowments. 1.1% of that money, and all of this money is managed for fee. 1.1% of that money, according to the GAO, is managed by women and people of color. That's the real power in this country. So we run an effort to try to improve those numbers. And a conversation I had with the CIO of NYU was illustrative 2 years ago. $4.5 billion endowment. How much of it is with women and people of color? I don't know. That means she didn't ask. She didn't care. What do we have to do it? And I get several reasons why, well, we're in index funds, they really blah, 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 it really doesn't matter. And after 30 minutes, I got to the upshot. We've been with J.P. Morgan for 43 years. I don't see us making a change. Are there people of color on the team at J.P. Morgan? I ask. I don't know, she says, which to me is code for I don't care. This is the structural problem we have. So I'll get to the operational. Thank you very much for that. The operational is that people with resources, people in positions of authority, which is largely white people, have to put more efforts into fixing these problems. First, as a moral matter, you have to see it as a problem. Once you see it as a problem, you have to put systems in place to ameliorate it. So Green 2.0 is a test of that. It is a campaign, hold that name for a second, to demonstrate whether we could, as an exogenous matter from outside of the system, working with the system, move an entire sector, not a particular organization, on the question of people of color in authoritative positions. The leadership deficit we have for people of color is true in most sectors, except the anti-poverty sector, which is among the weakest sectors in the nation. It is true in reproductive rights. It is true in LGBT. It is amazingly true in immigration. It is true across the board on the social justice sectors about which I care that we have a deficit of people of color in charge. Talking about boards, C-suites, EDs, general's counsel, asset manager. I'm not talking about the janitorial contract. We've got that. So Green 2.0 is a template. It's to see how you run a campaign to bring people of color into leadership positions at the top. And the great news is it's working. We need to continue to refine it and improve it and figure out how the system responds, what are the exogenous variables that move the system, what's not a good use of time, how much activism you need. When we refine the template, we will move on to other sectors, because what's true in the environmental sector, that there is much more talent of people of color than there is demand for people of color at the top. We will deploy these tactics in other sectors. But I'll repeat, the good news is it's working. So what's the it, and then I'll stop. Green 2.0 is a campaign. A campaign is a term of art in policy. You have a defined goal. Our goal is to bring people of color into leadership positions in the environmental sector across the board, foundations, NGOs, government actors, those aspects of corporations that see themselves in the sustainability or environmental piece. The target are the decision makers in those entities. You have to demonstrate supply. The wonderful news in 2018 is, like in other sectors, we have ample supply of people of color who are well positioned to take on positions of responsibility. And the last part of a campaign is you have to improve demand. There are multiple ways to do that. Those are the tactics. They are the careful and slow conversations, everything up to activism, true activism. I'll stop with a truism about change and dealing with humans, which is we divide into three tranches, generally speaking. This is for all change. It's within your family, it's within organizational change, and it's certainly within this campaign. There's a tranche of men and women, or non-gender specific people, who want to do the change you are talking about. It's sort of the where have you been? It's been on my to-do list. I haven't gotten around to it. Thank you. How do we work together? They are a blessing. Some of the leaders in the NGOs in the environmental sector are those people. They have been a delight to work with. The other extreme, the second tranche, are the hell no's. I know what you're up to. I know what you want. It's not like we haven't thought about it. I don't want to make the change you want me to make. In a campaign, those are objects. You're not actually going to engage them. You're going to use them as foils to speak to the third tranche, which is most of us. I haven't really thought about it. Diversity, that's interesting. What does that mean? We tried. It didn't work. Sort of a range of people who were mostly of good faith, mostly clueless, mostly afraid. They're not personally afraid of doing what you want. They're afraid of the system. They're afraid of being the leader on this question. That's where the core work happens. You get to decide, and I'm going to assume you all are campaign managers, you get to decide how you want to comport yourself with those people. You want to be angry, you want to be conciliatory, you want to play an inside game or an outside game. That's sort of the joy of campaign work. It's very multifaceted. But the leadership of Green 2.0, and there are many people working on it, this is not a profit center for anybody, spends a lot of time cultivating in that tranche, helping people with best practices, showing them the actual talent, holding their hand as they figure out how to move their systems. And it's working. I'll end with it's working. We need you to be involved. We need you to learn. We need you to speak up. We need you to teach us the language. We need you to shout. Change doesn't happen in pluralism without some shouting. My deep, deep, deep appreciation to Whitney Tome, who is our fearless leader at Green 2.0, and her vision and her acumen and her ability to organize an event like this to bring more and more people into this struggle is just awesome and worthy of our admiration. So thank you for setting up this day. Thank you all.
Now all can see why it's fun working for him, right? It's part of the fun. All right, so we're going to get really into the weeds now a little bit. So I'm going to invite our first panel up to come join me and come take a seat. I'm going to do a quick introduction of them, and then we're going to get started. Come on. All right. we ready? Can you all hear me? Great. All right, so we have a wonderful panel, and we're really going to focus on a couple of key things. Really the pipeline. And first I'm going to introduce the panel from my left to right. So at the end, Anthony Tanzamore. He is the managing director and founder of Blue Ridge Advisors, a search firm based out in San Francisco, California. Next to him is Plavati Fatil, who is the deputy executive director of the Rainforest Action Network. Next to her, Ebony Martin, who's the chief officer of people and culture at Greenpeace USA. And then last, Myra Mathis, who is executive search consultant at Nonprofit HR. And what we really wanted to bring together with this panel was a couple of things. One, thinking about this executive pipeline. So when you actually are thinking about getting people of color, especially into those C-suite positions, what does it take? What does it take from both the NGO perspective? So what are you looking for? What do you want? What do you need in that kind of new leader? But also, how is your culture organizationally going to be ready for and receptive for those new leaders to build them, to grow them, and develop them? But more importantly, when you also look outside and say, all right, we need to find this new leader, but maybe we don't have the depth of a bench or the depth of a network that we want, what do you look for? How do you find search consultants who are also able to hand you that diverse talent? And is your search consultant really a partner in this effort, or someone just handed you a list of names? And we at Green 2.0 recognized with our Diversity Derailed report back in December of 2016 that this partnership is really critically important. You both need to know what you're looking for and be specific. So as Dr. Coleman said, what are you looking for? Are you looking for a person of color? Are you looking for a woman? Are you looking for a member of the LGBT community? Are you specific about what you want? First off. And then two, are you ready for that as an organization? Have you built the foundation and the groundwork? And then have you asked your search consultant a lot of questions? And this is the one thing that we often find, which is, are you just looking for somebody to just fill a role that you needed last week and in the next 5 minutes, right? Because you always need somebody now, right? Or are you really looking for that partner to help you think about what is the culture of our organization? How and what kind of talent are we looking for? Do we need to help coach people at all through this process? What does that look like as an external partner looking at an organization for either the first time or the 10th time? How are they in their journey when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion? And on and on. So what I'd like to do is give our panelists a few minutes for opening remarks, and then I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll hopefully open it up to you all. Should we start? Myra, you want to give a start?
I think the other thing that I'd like to add about the conversation is that we have to be really honest about what we're looking for. The conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion makes a lot of people uncomfortable because we begin to speak about color, we begin to speak about religion, sexual orientation, and all of those things that we've been taught are off limits at work. But in reality, we're recognizing that none of it's off limits because everyone brings their entire life to work with them, whether they bring it in the way they're thinking, the way that they interact with one another. So it's very important for us to be purposeful and honest about what diversity really looks like for our organizations. And until we're honest about it, then we can't answer the question, are we ready? And once we have answered that question, once we are honest, then we can move on to being ready and answering some of the harder questions about, are we actually putting forward a face of diversity, equity, and inclusion by who's already within the organization? So then it becomes what comes first, the chicken or the egg. But we do have some thoughts on how we'll help you figure that out. So I'm very interested in continuing the conversation.
Good morning. Hello. Okay, good morning, everyone. So I started at Greenpeace about 5 years ago, and I began as the talent acquisition manager, and I was kind of given the mandate to build and diversify the pipeline and also to diversify our staff. And what I quickly found out is building the pipeline is in vain if the internal culture is not ready. We needed to take a closer look at our policies. Were they equitable? Is our compensation equitable? Are our staff aware of implicit bias? How do we give them tools to operationalize those things? So saying you care about equity, diversity, and inclusion, that's nice, but if you're not operationalizing it in your everyday work, and you're not creating a welcome and inclusive environment for these diverse individuals you want to bring into the organization, it's really all in vain. So I had to go on a campaign to get in front of senior leadership to help them to understand a mandate just simply isn't enough. We need to go a bit deeper, and as you said, have those deep conversations, figure out what it really means for Greenpeace to change internally, and then a deep commitment, not just from myself, but also from the senior leaders. Because if they don't drive it, it won't happen. So helping them to also understand that as well. So I look forward to delving into this.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you to Whitney and the Green 2.0 team for putting this together. All of us here, obviously on the panel, are deeply committed to the issue. And from the Rainforest Action Network's point of view, I'd say that we've, for 30 plus years of our organizational history, worked a lot on anti-oppression in all its forms. And a lot of our work has been externally focused. And in the past 4 to 5 years, we realized that we have a lot of internal work to do as well. And we are, as our peer organizations, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, and others who are not in the room, are white-funded, white-founded, white-led organizations. And unless we have a recognition of that history and that context, it's rather difficult to move away from it to imagine the future that we all want. So I'm really looking forward to digging deeper into some of these issues and figuring out, once we have the commitment, how do we move to the desired goals that we have for it?
Good morning, everybody. How are you this morning? It is about 6 o'clock my time in California, so I will try to be coherent and alert throughout this conversation. Whitney, thank you for inviting me, and I'm very happy to be with you all this morning. I often find myself the skunk at the executive search garden party because I came to this work as a frustrated client. I had hired search consultants to help fill program officer positions for me, senior executive roles for me when I was in foundations and nonprofits, and they would always come with a list of names. We didn't have the conversation that I wanted to have, and they didn't know what I wanted in a program officer or a staff member. I didn't even know what I wanted, but I wanted a partner to help me think about how does this role fit in the context of my entire program team, what I'm trying to achieve, and so on. So I jumped into this thinking, I can do this work better than these schlubs. And it's hard work because I find myself pushing clients all the time. I do CEO searches and working with boards, and 95% of the time find myself the only person of color in the boardroom trying to push the conversation about increasing diversity, at least having a diverse pool of candidates. I also consider myself more than just a search consultant. I'm more of a management consultant because I bring to my clients a broader perspective based on my professional, personal experiences. I do a lot of leadership coaching and onboarding coaching. I do a lot of coaching for boards and helping boards shift their governance practices to be more practical, to be more open. And so, you know, I will say to a board, I don't want to work with you unless you're willing to have the conversation. I often walk away from a number of conversations. So I'm happy to be in this room with my fellow panelists here to push this conversation forward.
Great. So I'm going to start, I think, mainly with Myron Anthony. In looking at an organization, you know, when you first get that first interview with your client and say, all right, is this going to be a real relationship? What does that look like? How do you know that a client and a firm is really ready for this conversation? And what are some of the questions both you ask them and the ways in which you push them in that even initial conversation?
Well, one of the things that I think I can say that I count a blessing is that most people, when they come to nonprofit HR, especially for executive searches, because they have recognized an issue with diversity, equity, and inclusion. We are a woman of color-owned firm, very proud of that. And as a result of that, when people see the faces on the website when they're doing the search, if they are interested in a diverse hire, we are right at the top of their list. But then it comes to questions do we ask to tell whether or not they're ready? And I begin to speak to clients about their pain. Where's your pain? Why do you feel that you need a diverse hire? Is it because of the Glassdoor reviews? Or is it because you really recognize that you're missing something in the marketplace? You're missing something with the constituents that your organization serves. And if the answers are slanted toward, we feel like we're missing the mark, our executives do not look like the people that we're serving, and they are hard-pressed to believe that we're actually coming in to make a difference. And when I hear that type of conversation, I begin to think, you all may be ready for a conversation. Because it is true. A lot of the organizations that are working for constituents that are people of color, women, and other disenfranchised communities, many of them, you go into the boardroom and they're all white faces. You go into the program staff and there are all white faces. You go to the volunteers and you may begin to see some peppers of color here and there. But imagine the thinking of an organization, of a community of people where an organization comes in and they profess to be there to help. We're hashtag here to help, right? But no one that has come in looks anything like them. How are you going to get these people to believe that you even understand how they're thinking? And this is the conversation that I begin to have with the boards of directors that contact nonprofit HR, the senior leaders that we end up interviewing prior to beginning any search. We want to know, how are you even identifying with your constituents? How are you even able to tell what they're thinking? What practices do you implement in order to be able to even develop programming? How do you know that this programming is even anything that these people need? And by having these types of conversations, I begin to be able to centralize that conversation around diversity and really begin to show how it can hit your bottom line, which in nonprofit is not really a dollar, it's the impact, right? The difference that we're able to make in people's lives. And there has to be a level of trust set up on the front end, and having someone see a face that they identify does some really good work right there in the beginning with building that trust.
Yeah, we take a similar approach to what Myra has referenced. But I often will ask, I know a lot of clients come to me because I was referred by another search firm. They didn't want to tackle it. So I will get a call from somebody saying, so-and-so suggested that we reach out to you. And I will ask them, is diversity a part of the conversation? Or do you want diversity to be a part of the conversation? Yeah, but we want somebody really good. Or, yeah, but. So I will go into the boardroom to meet them, and sometimes people are frozen because I am the only person of color sitting in the boardroom, and I'll ask them, what kind of impact are you trying to create? What communities are you in? Are you open to being pushed? Are you open to my asking you questions that may be uncomfortable? Are you open to having the conversation? Most boards are very uncomfortable having wide-ranging conversations. They just want to get the damn search done, and they want to get it done in 2 months. And it's like a freight train moving through. But I try to slow them down, and so I'll listen to. Is there a group of people on the board that is open to having this conversation? Can I rely on them to help open the conversation with their peers? I will often, I always say to boards, I want to have a conversation with your staff. staffs want to work in diverse environments. You know, millennials do not want to work in all-white, straight environments. They want to work in a very, very diverse culture. And so I will ask a board, can I interview your staff members and bring that back to you? And that will oftentimes open up the conversation.
Great, that's wonderful. So Vivati and Ebony, when you think about hiring a search firm, what are you looking for in a partner? What are you looking for to help you, both on a practical sense, but also in the partnership sense?
Someone to have those hard conversations with us, not just me, because most times I'm there, but I have to bring everybody else along. And so sometimes you need outside validation because you're in it every day, but sometimes you have to bring in the experts to help others understand and to bring us on this journey. Also, I ask for references. I also want to see success rates, where people are placed that executive search firms have placed in other organizations. We also look at basically people that are courageous enough to have those hard conversations with us. I think that's very intimidating, walking into C-suites that are all white. And of course, everyone will say we want diversity, but actually when you start to have those conversations and you start to dig in, there might be a little of alternative motives. So really uncovering what that is.
Yeah, I think similarly for us, either we go through a search firm or are doing our own searches. The first question for me is, are we breaking the cycle of friends of friends and hiring of friends? Because there's a revolving door that exists in the environmental nonprofit community, and our networks look very similar to the people who already occupy these organizations. So my question to any help that we hire or the searches that we are doing is, how are we broadening the networks that, one, we might not already have or need help on? So sort of that's the main piece of it. The other thing is recognition that people who we bring on a hiring committee don't hire as a job. Like, their job is not to hire for different positions. So reminders and trainings and processes and practices that make it clear, make it easier for people who are involved in the search process to actually pay attention to things like implicit bias, the reasons why we are trying to diversify, and really trying to keep it away from tokenizing and thinking about bean counting in terms of the numbers of people we have, the diversity checkboxes that we're hitting, but paying attention to the organization we want to create, the impact that we want to have.
I also think something else is really important. When search firms can help us to identify our preferences versus our traditions versus what's the actual requirement for the job. And I think many times we correlate our preferences and actual requirements as the same thing when they're really not. So helping us also to surface really what that is. I think that's something very important.
I think that's a great, I want to sort of continue on this conversation a little bit around culture and hiring, which is when you think about the sort of hiring process, you know, from creating the job description all the way through to the final decision, what are you all putting in place? And this was really for all four of you. What do you help to either put a client in place to think about how do you start breaking down some of those biases? And then internally, what are you all doing when it comes to either the hiring committee, the rubrics, other things that you're using to try to unearth this and try to get beyond the sort of traditional, but into like what's possible?
Yeah, I can start. So the first thing that, at least in my short time at the Rainforest Action Network, that I've been doing is consulting with a lot of peer organizations who have moved, from my point of view, in the right direction, who are putting a lot of thought behind their hiring practices. And a few things that have emerged from that are things such as voluntary demographic questionnaires. So we know that biases play out when people are looking at resumes, so being very clear about actually reversing that bias to say, we are committed to diversity and equity and inclusion in our hiring process, And so we have a voluntary questionnaire which we ask applicants to fill out. We also have done what you're just talking about, Whitney, which is really separating what is required and thinking about requirements not just for the job, specifically for the job, but also requirements that we want people who align with our values, including values that relate directly to racial equity and justice, and then using questions during interview that connect back to the values that we are espousing. So far, I've seen a big disconnect between how we, in a job description, talk about, oh, we are committed to diversity, but not really bringing it back in the interview process to probe questions of the candidates on those softer skills or behavioral questions that get to what kind of person do you want in that position outside of hard technical skills that you're looking for.
Well, and I interview the client. I mean, culture is a huge aspect of what I'm trying to get behind. And I try to understand both from the board perspective, from the staff perspective, what's the culture like? How do they operate? How do they make decisions? How do they deal with people who push back? And so, you know, that gives me a lot of information about the organization. And when I'm sourcing for candidates, I mean, I put that out there at the first level, but as we move through the process and we have serious candidates to bring forward, I will surface some of these things just to see how they react to it and how would they respond in a given situation. So like Pallavi said, I'll ask behavioral questions of the candidates and of the client to see if there's a match here.
Something else we do is ensure that our interview panels are diverse. And also when we do feedback, what we found is when we have individual reflections instead of a group feedback session, the results are often different. Sometimes noticing power dynamics, usually if a white male speaks about a candidate, that will color the way the rest of the panel speaks about a candidate. So taking people aside, asking for their direct feedback outside of the group, I've noticed that's also changed decisions, actually, and led to more equitable outcomes.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. Anonymizing feedback is very important because I think that a lot of us don't recognize when we're in the boardroom and an important decision is being made. If there is, first of all, if we don't have diversity of thought in the room in the first place, someone may not be as open to saying, no, I don't necessarily think this person is going to be the best fit. Again, I also want to point back to honesty in this process. And when we are developing the ideal profile for the candidate for this role, not just the qualifications and the number of years of experience and the education, we want to look at the core values of the organization. What type of person is going to fit in here? We're not just filling this role because open enrollment is coming and we absolutely must have a new HR director in here before open enrollment begins. Hire a consultant to come in and manage open enrollment for you, and pause and take some time to find out what does the person who is going to essentially be in charge of how every person that works here feels about this organization, because that's just how important that hire is. And we have to be very intentional and purposeful about culture and about diversity, equity, and inclusion processes. And we have to recognize sometimes the position may be open for 6 months, but it's much better that we keep this position open for 6 months and hire the person that is not only the technical fit, but also the cultural fit, so that we don't now have to conduct a cultural assessment to figure out all of the horrible things that this person has done to the culture of our organization, then bring in consultants to help fix the culture of the organization, to get it back at baseline before we can bring a new leader in that won't go running for the hills after their first 3 weeks in here. And now we can bring in a new leader because we've been able to fix the culture. I see some smiles, so I think that may have happened to a few people around here. And how grateful would you have been if we just paused for an extra 6 weeks or an extra 3 months and gotten it right? The culture of the organization is what drives the success of your organization. That's just the bottom line. There are no ifs, ands, or buts about it. I don't care how many Harvard doctorates you have in your senior staff. I don't care how many, the accolades, it can go through the roof. If the culture is not right, and it's up to you to define what right is. There's no standard answer for what's right. If the culture in your organization is not conducive to the overall demographic of the organization, meaning everyone's bought into it, senior leaders are the champions of it, then your organization will be much less successful than it could be.
So I want to probe a little bit on culture and fit. Because what we found is it can both be obviously a driver, like what culture eats strategy for breakfast, is the one thought. But the other one is a really, that fit can be sort of a euphemism often for lots of other things, which is, race or class or gender. So would love you all's thoughts on sort of navigating that fine line between recognizing that the culture of an organization is what it is, but potentially they're trying to change it, and using that as an excuse not to hire someone who is diverse. Very easy question, right?
Super easy question. I don't see how not hiring someone that's diverse could ever be backed up by the culture of an organization. Legitimately. And I think that if that is the response, then we have some serious work to do with the culture of the organization. But if we're thinking about basic things like culture, what is the work-life balance of the organization? Is working from home an easy thing where you can just pop up on Wednesday and shoot a note to the office and say, I'm working from home today, and no one raises an eyebrow? Is your office the type where everyone's in around 7 and everybody's gone at 3? Is your office the type where, we don't really set meetings? We just come into each other's offices and powwow here and there. That might throw people off. And that goes beyond some of the more traditional things that we think of with fit. But that's a good place to start, because then we can talk about what about our values drive that culture. So why is it that we're a powwowing type of organization where we don't really just set these hour-long meetings and we can just pop into each other's offices? Because we're the type of organization that we have to have our thumb on the pulse of whatever's going on in affordable housing, and we just have to get something out right away. Or if something's happening in the green movement where we have to respond, our executive director has to get something out right away. That's the culture of the organization. And if you're bringing people in that don't fit, they might be great at what they do, but they won't thrive if they don't fit in that type of culture.
No, that's a very important point. And oftentimes when we come into organizations to run a search, an organization is at a major inflection point. The founder is leaving after 40 years, or the executive director, CEO is leaving after 20 years, and they've had such a huge presence in the organization, and so everything that the board and staff see is in the context of that person. So anybody coming in is going to have a hard time fitting into that role. But I will ask a board, what is it that you're trying to do? What's your vision of the future? Let's focus on how are you trying to change as an organization? And this is the perfect time. You have an opportunity at this transition to change how you do things, to expand the way that you look at the world. And let's try on, for me, it's sort of like trying on different suits. I will say to a board, I want to bring to you a number of different people who are going to look very different. And you might scratch your head and say, what the hell is this guy doing? Does he really know what he's doing? But I want to force a broader conversation about how do we need to show up? How do we need to change? Because oftentimes, the burden is on the CEO who the board hires to make to fit in, right? But boards don't often reflect on how do we need to change our way of doing business. We've done business for the last 20 years with this man or woman. But we know we're not going to have the same type of person as the departing CEO. And that's a hard thing for boards to get their heads around. So I'll start the onboarding conversation early in the process and start asking that question even before we start recruiting, because I want them to reflect on it, and I'll keep pushing on that. And by the time we get to the end of the process, hopefully we'll have some answers to that question.
I would also say in terms of fit, is this a culture that we want? We have to change the way the culture is, because obviously what fits now is not what's working. So there is a evolution process that needs to take place. So that means when you bring in someone that's different, it's going to rub a bit different. It's going to rub. You're trying to get polished, and you can't get irritated by every polish. Also, in terms of building a movement, you cannot build a movement if you think everything's supposed to fit jointly the way you want it to fit. So one thing that I've been challenging our staff and our senior leaders is when you say fit, is that in terms of what you know now, or is that in terms of where we're trying to go? As you said, vision. What movement are we trying to build? We don't need people to continue to fit in the way we're moving, because we're not really moving where we need to be. So we need to work on what we classify as fit.
Great.
Yeah. So when I was thinking, you talk about organizational culture, I was thinking of a very different aspect of it. And I have a colleague here. We are part of a group, a staff-led group that is examining what that organizational culture is and what is the internal work that we need to do to actually shift it. So the fit question is really tricky, as Ebony was saying. Is it the fit with the existing culture or fit with the culture that we want it to be? So for me, the kinds of things that we are emphasizing paying attention to is the person that we want to hire at a leadership level, is that someone who is open to sharing power, access, and resources, because ultimately that's what dictates why we have people in the positions where we have them, and how open are they to shifting the dynamic that we have, not only within our own ranks, but also in the work that we do externally with our partners, with our allies, with organizations that we run campaigns with. Are we willing to share that access and power and resources? And so it's a very, it's a conversation much more to the heart of where this individual is coming from, as opposed to the experiences that they had, the organizations where they've worked, and the specific skill set that they're bringing to the table.
Great, thank you. I'm going to start priming you all to start thinking about what questions you potentially have for this panel. I'm going to ask one more question. This is sort of probably more for Myra and Anthony, but when you start bringing in that first group of candidates, what questions do they have about the organization? And what do you tell them sort of as that fun external third party that can really give a more honest, often assessment of the place that they might be going?
So this is where boards get scared, because they ask me, how much do you tell a candidate? And I tell them I don't hold anything back. It's not I'm disparaging, but I'm laying out for a candidate what's going on in the organization. So I want to test, how does that candidate respond? And then what questions do they have about the organization? And in a way, it's sort of priming them to meet with the board and to start that conversation with board. So oftentimes, serious candidates will ask, so tell me about the culture. How would you describe the culture? How do you make decisions? What are you expecting of a CEO? And so, boards are in some ways sometimes prepared for those kinds of questions. Oftentimes they're not. It's when I get to the finalists that I have that serious conversation about. Let's just sort of talk about what's happening in the organization. I've had some candidates walk away saying, I'm not ready to take this on. I don't want to be, the flag bearer for diversity if the organization isn't ready for it.
Absolutely, and I generally start with the question back to them, what type of culture are you looking for? Because I've found that, especially in the nonprofit sector, when we're recruiting for executive director and CEO roles, sometimes the candidates are so smitten with the organization and the idea of being the leader of this organization that they will just automatically think that they can assimilate to whatever culture I tell them the organization holds or whatever culture the organization is trying to shift to. So to eliminate any of those happenstantial synergies, I ask them, what type of culture are you looking for in your next role? What type of culture do you thrive in? I also ask them, what type of culture do you drive? Because we also recognize that culture within the organization is driven from the top. And I see if there are any synergies there between what I know the client is looking for and what they say they thrive in, and then we can continue the conversation. One of the things about executive search is that you have basically hired a personal shopper for your role. So if you tell me you're a size 12 dress and you need a size 12 for a party on Friday, I'm not gonna come and bring you a size 14 and say, well, we can cinch in the back. I'm going to bring you a size 12, right? And to that end, sometimes it takes me a little bit longer to find the 12, but I'm not bringing you anything other than a 12. So for me, it's really important that I have very difficult conversations on the front end. I almost give them the absolute worst picture in the beginning just to let them know, and then I kind of back off of it the more serious they become, to give them an even more realistic picture, because I want them to understand the brevity of whatever their cultural makeup is, how that's going to affect the organization. And going back to something that Ebony said earlier about, are we hiring the executive for the culture that is current? Or are we hiring an executive to take us into the future? And has the board sat and had that conversation about what the future looks like? Have we been intentional about the steps that need to be taken in order to move us into the future? And if those things have been done, now we're prepared to begin asking questions about what culture a new executive will thrive best in. And then again, going back to honesty and recognizing, as much as we may love this person, as much as we may be impressed by their background, and as much as we just knew they were a fit, we placed an order for this person, in the end, they might not be. And it's really important to understand that one bad hire, especially at the executive level, can set a course of action that will take years to reverse. And I know an extra 6 months sounds like a long time. I keep throwing that number out there, and everybody that's doing a search, they cringe. Oh God, an extra 30 days. Oh gosh, it's just going on and on and on. But imagine if we hire the wrong person, it takes us a year to figure that out. I mean, I can go on and on. It's very important.
I want to follow up on something that Myra said. I just finished a search that took me 12 months. So it was a COO search, and the CEO was so starstruck. And oftentimes boards are starstruck. They want the brilliant CEO who has the great pedigree and who can bring attention to their organization. And I've got to get them past that, because often stars fizzle. And oftentimes in the first few days, if not the first few months. And on the other side, candidates can get starstruck. If you're working with a well-known organization, they want to be associated with that organization. And I have many times after a first round of interviews said to a board, I don't think these candidates are right for you, and here's why. And so I sit in and coach them through the interview. Sometimes boards want to do it on their own, but I will coach them through it, and I'll offer my own assessment. I will be wrong about some people that I've brought to boards, but the people that I thought were really great performers and who could be good potential candidates for CEO just lose it when they get in front of a board. And so I have difficult conversations with both boards and with candidates.
Great. All right. Are there any questions from the audience for this panel? Please, there are actually 2 microphones right in the middle of the room, so feel free to come on up and ask a question or 2. And we'd love to also get your name, if at all possible, just so we know who to comment to.
Hi, thank you so much. Whitney knows I always have a question. My name is Raywyn Grant. I'm a biologist at the American Museum of Natural History here in New York City. Thank you guys so much. My question goes back to one of the first things that Anthony said on the panel, and you just touched on it, but you didn't go much further. And it's about when organizations or individuals feel like they are either hiring for diversity or hiring for excellence. And of course, we know that's an extremely offensive way of thinking, but to the entire panel, have you all seen people actually change that thinking? Certainly, they might revoke those ideas publicly, but have you actually seen a shift in people fusing this idea of excellence and people from diverse backgrounds? Thank you.
Absolutely. I won't name the organization because it wasn't one of their shining moments, but in having some initial conversations about a senior executive search, the board of directors made it clear that they would like a person of color in the role, if at all possible. And they went through all of the concessions that they were willing to make in order for us to find a person of color to take on this role. And I sat in the room, trying my best not to be personally offended, and went out to find this person that I knew existed. I just knew that they were, I had 3 people in my pipeline already that were people of color that were perfect. And when we came into the room to review the semifinalists for the role, one of the, I don't put pictures on the resumes or anything when we're going through profiles of candidates. And one of the members of the search committee raised her hand at the end and said, just out of curiosity, out of this group of 12, how many are people of color? I said, all of them. And she says, all of them? I said, yes. And she said, and I said, but they're also qualified? And she just kind of, and we moved on very quickly from that moment. And very quickly from that moment. But it was a great victory because we were able to tick off all 5 of the top 5 qualifications that they were looking for. And all 12 of my panel of people of color had everything that they were looking for. And I think that was a defining moment in many of those people's experience because we spent a lot of time in the prep for this search making concessions for the things that they were willing to do without if we could find a person of color. So it does exist, but we're doing the best that we can to change it.
I think, can I just add one thing? Thank you for that question. I think a lot of times excellence is also code for, is this person gonna do things exactly the way we have done things? So it's really important when people have arguments such as excellence or qualifications to really try to dig deeper as to what does that mean. Does that mean that they'll make spreadsheets the way you made, that they will write things the way you wrote, or you have flexibility and openness to really the basic desire for that job and qualification?
Myra, thank you for that wonderful example. But I think it befits if you're able to actually deliver that full suite, it's amazing what the transformation can be at a panel of people who weren't expecting it. And I think one of the reasons why we brought you all here was to really think about that. If you're looking for something and start making concessions, you're making concessions on an assumption, potentially not reality. Yeah. And think about the biases that go into making all of those like minute assumptions around requirements. Well, the person probably won't be able to, or they might not be. I can think about my own first job, actually, where I met all but one of the requirements. And it was the one that I thought would be the most important, which is having 1 to 3 years of fishery management experience. Person working on fish and oceans, like that's, I assumed that was gonna be a bar, right? Like, I know nothing about this. But at the time, my boss was open to being like, look, you have everything else, I can teach you the content. But recognizing like you have all those other skills and that's sufficient for the thing I actually really need. And I think even for her to recognize like, oh, maybe that actually isn't a bar. Like I thought it was when I actually wrote it on the first time on the job description, but it actually is not. And so I think getting to that exact point, like what are the concessions you're starting to make without recognizing that you're making them? And to make those explicit and to pull those out, especially when you have search consultants who can be like, was that really needed? What do you really need? But also internally, how do you pull those out? We have a couple more questions, so I'm gonna let you all get started.
Oh, hi. My name is Malachi Robinson, and I work with Pallavi at the Rainforest Action Network on the palm oil campaign. And my question is about accountability. So when campaigning against like corporate targets, you always want to be wary of a company that's going to keep you in perpetual like dialoguing. And I see that happening in the nonprofit sector and just in the broader progressive movement around like, let's have talks about diversity and inclusion, but what happens after the talks and like, how do you keep people accountable to those goals that they've set?
Should I field this one maybe a little bit? So from the Green 2.0 front, we're doing this a little bit with our transparency cards, and we're now gonna do a report card this coming year, which is to say, have you actually changed your numbers? And watch your data over time. Because one of the ways to do it is knowing what is the composition of my staff and board? How diverse is it truly? How close are we getting? And how do we want to see that change? And at least as an external party, we can do that in a very different way than an internal party. But the other thing is, do you actually have internal benchmarks as an organization? Do you know what your vision for your culture is? Do you know how you're going to know you're going to get there? And what are the steps along the way? Do you know what your statistics are when it comes to staff and board? Are you tracking those? Are you measuring them? Do you have exit interviews? Do you know if there's a great disparity in trends for the people who are leaving the organization? I was talking with an organization a couple of months ago, and they recognized that they were having a great disparity in exits of people of color and whites. People of color were leaving after 3 or so years, whites were leaving after 8 to 10. But if you don't actually know that, you don't know that you have a problem. So in part, are you collecting some of both of the data, quantitative, but also qualitative? Do you have stories about the people who are in the organization, how they're experiencing the organization right now, versus the stories of the people who have left? You need both those kinds of data to know where you're going, and then think about putting this also at the top of that board benchmark list. How do they know as a board to help hold you accountable on the diversity and inclusion work you want to do? Do you have benchmarks for them? Do they see them? Do they help you as an organization hold you accountable? Any other thoughts?
I would say, and then going a step further, is making sure that your leadership and your management operationalize these things. What are the benchmarks that your leaders and your managers are setting? Are all of the goals set with an equity lens in mind? Are you tracking disparity across your department? What are your trends within that? And then holding those managers accountable to that. That's the way I think we've noticed the greatest change, is when we actually have like those small departmental meetings and say, okay, in this program, this is what we're tracking. What do you think that's constituted to? What are your ideas to change it? Let's put it down on paper and let's track it over the year so that we're not just waiting till the end of the year. 6-month mark, where are you? Oh, we're still struggling here. Do you need more tools? What is it that we need to do? So it's operationalizing a lot of it, I believe, as well.
If I can add one other thing is, I think Myra and Anthony both talked about the time durations that are needed for doing a thoughtful search. And so one accountability measure is making sure that we are differentiating between what's urgent and what's important, and that we create the time and space that's needed, recognizing that we currently don't have the kinds of networks where we'll easily be able to get a diverse pool of candidates. So shifting things as if you're in a position of power to be able to say, okay, this is a priority for the organization, and we can move other things around for you to be able to do a good job of what you have at hand.
Take 2 more questions.
Thank you. My name is Daniel Goldberg, grade S. I'm a third year here at the law school. Thank you all so much for coming. I had a conversation with a friend of mine who runs a traditional environmental group, and by traditional I mean is focused on climate change and protecting open space and clean air and clean water, and doesn't have a environmental justice lens with any, really to speak of. They've received a lot of flack recently for the lack of diversity in their hiring and in their staff, and I was talking with her about it. And she said something really interesting and kind of troubling to me. She said it's important to us, but it's not mission critical.
Let me see how far she goes with that.
Yeah. Well, the organization is not doing well. I mean, people are leaving
So
because
it might
of this.
actually be mission critical.
Exactly, right. So she compared the organization to the Sierra Club. She said for the Sierra Club, they found that it is mission critical. Like they've literally changed, to her, I don't know about this, but she said they've actually changed their mission, incorporated DEI into their mission. But for this organization, she felt that they're not going to do that. And I thought, then you're not going to do anything. But I'd wonder, how do you respond to that?
To your friend or to the organization?
To an organization.
I mean, the truth of the matter is an organization that is catching flack for their lack of diversity, equity, and inclusion really just needs a mirror to be held up, because you guys are being very delusional about the impact of diversity, equity, and inclusion on your impact bottom line. And it's a matter of having a tough my first suggestion as a consultant, honestly, would be to order a cultural assessment for them, and have an outside consultant to come in and do an extensive interview with the staff. And I promise those diversity, equity, and inclusion issues are going to come up. And when they come up and you put it in a report and and you correlate it with the effectiveness of their mission, they'll be able to see that it is actually mission critical. So if your friend can get to the people who make these types of decisions, I would definitely suggest a cultural assessment, because they may not see that it's impacting them right now. And unfortunately, organizations wait way too long to see that it's an issue. And then you have to do these entire overhauls of the organizational culture, when it could have really been something that we could, just a program that we can be very purposeful about and ingrain in the culture as we're going along, as opposed to it being a thing that has to be fixed. But I would suggest a cultural assessment, honestly, to let the people inside say what's really going on.
I would also suggest, the problem I see is a lot of environmental NGOs see themselves as standalones, when we really need to work intersectionally and cross-functionally as a part of a broader movement. That is, if we're trying to win at the end of the day. I would ask, what are her overall goals? And I really don't see how there would be a win possible with only certain voices at the table.
Unfortunately, that's not an unusual conversation. I hear it a lot, quite frankly, not just with environmental organizations, but across the nonprofit sector. There is a book that sometimes when this conversation comes up, I will refer people to this book called The Difference by Scott Page. Some of you may know it. Whitney and I talked about it, and you may have read it. Scott Page is a mathematician at the University of Michigan. So if you are not a mathematician, it's a hard slog to get through. But the essence of the book is that people, and it's about cognitive diversity, people who bring different points of view to a discussion lead to a better decision. And so I will open up the conversation, if I hear what your friend has told you, by talking about the book and opening up the conversation, and people will be receptive to that. And then take it to, okay, let's find out other things about the culture of the organization. What impact are you trying to have? You know, as much as I say we need to push organizations, you sort of need to meet them where they are and start the conversation and move them. Some organizations will move faster than others. Some may still resist, but you need to sort of see where they are and then start the conversation from there.
The other thing is, pose the question back to your friend. What is the mission as they view it? And if they're working in the field of environment, climate change, forest preservation, none of it can not be mission critical because the communities that are affected by any of these areas are disproportionately people of color. So to think of your mission absent the people who are affected by it, there's a flaw in the mission, not in the way they're approaching it.
Thank you.
Yeah, the last thing I'll add is actually, you know, this transformation, we're talking a lot about organizations, but it's also people. And the question is, where is she as a person in thinking about these issues? And is her own network diverse enough for her to recognize the potential flaw that's going on here? And part is often this work is both personal as well as organizational, which is, do I experience the world? How do I experience it? And then how do other people experience it differently from me? And then do I recognize that difference? And then am I able to harness that difference over time to help me be better and to help our organization be better? And so both of those things have to happen. Both recognition personally, but also organizationally. And that's often the super squishy part of this work, is recognizing that you also have to personally change as well as the organization has to change. Thank you. Great question.
Thank you.
Last question, and then we'll close out the panel.
Hi, I'm Megan Riley-Caton. I'm on the board of the National Environmental Education Foundation, and one of my fellow board members is here, Robert Garcia. We are actually in a process of a search for an executive, and so a lot of this has been timely. I wish I had met some of you a few months ago, as we're quite advanced. But my question, I've learned a lot from today around the hiring side of things and identifying candidates, but as we look forward to onboarding candidates, we're an organization with a board and a staff that is very committed to diversity, inclusion and equity. It's a long journey, and we're, probably, I don't want to know how I'm sure the vision is much farther than where we currently are, I'll just put it that way. But we certainly have made great progress. We're dedicated to reaching all Americans, and so we're very focused on that, on reaching all Americans and making sure that we have a staff and a board that reflects that. As we think about onboarding candidates and making sure that candidates are the right person, there's certainly the evaluation of how they, to the extent you can evaluate attitudes, behavior, openness, a lot of those other things. Some of the candidates may not have much of a background that will allow us to evaluate past actions, so we'll be looking at attitudes and how they would approach things in the future. But we're very focused on making sure that candidate is educated. We are identifying candidates who lack that education and lack the language and are afraid to talk about it. It's kind of all those things. We're in the odd situation where we may have a board that's more open and interested in talking about it than the candidates we're interviewing. So I'm curious, from your perspective, are there resources, tips? Have you been in this situation before? What are good ways, as we think about kind of designing an education process prior to bringing someone on, that we might incorporate to make sure that, certainly if in that process we find that the attitude is not right, then that's a fundamental problem. But if we think the attitude is there and the education is not, how do we catch up? Thank you.
In developing any orientation or onboarding plan, especially for an executive, I think it's very important to recognize all of the information that people are receiving when they start a new job, just pure logistically. So it's very important to break out the things that they absolutely must know right now in order to be able to get started, and then to create a plan where they can learn the information in a way that they will be able to retain it. I can take my own orientation at nonprofit HR, for example. I don't think that Patty did this on purpose, but it worked out really well in that a part of my training and my learning about the firm as well as previous clients that we had, it was kind of a learning as we go. I had her with me through every major step of the process, where we would get to another step and pause, and it would be a learning experience. And it would be a learning experience incorporating the nonprofit HR way of doing things with room for me to take ownership of this practice that I'm now leading. Giving the information, the institutional knowledge, and the things that absolutely have to be done in a certain way, with room for the new executive to be able to bring all of the things that are the reasons why you hired them in the first place to kind of shape the way they're doing it. And an executive orientation process should be taking 6 months to a year, if we're being completely honest. So first 90 days, it's how do we file expense reports, time, keep all of the rest of these kinds of things, and institutional knowledge you need in order to be able to speak intelligently about the organization as you're going about the course of being the spokesperson, the new spokesperson for the organization. But the rest of it needs to happen in an organic way. And I would really encourage including the board of directors in the process as well, because it's going to be really important that very early on the new executive has a great relationship with the board, because they are the liaison between the rest of the organization and the board of directors. And it's really important to kind of set those boundaries in the beginning as well. I have a whole other spiel on board executive relations, but in a nutshell, I would say that to be very intentional, very intentional, especially in the beginning, but then also making it an organic process so that the information is retained easily.
Yeah, I mandate an onboarding process when I work with a client. And the first 3 months, I say to the board, the first 3 months of a new executive's tenure are about listening, learning, and assessing. They shouldn't be doing any major things in those first 3 months. And then the second part of that, to Myra's point, is after that 3-month period, and they're beginning to get a sense of the organization, what are the 3 or 4 essential things that they need to know and be proficient on to be successful in this role? And so you track their progress towards their achieving their proficiency in those 3 or 4 things. And I'm often, I developed a coaching practice because the board said, we don't know how to do this. Can you help us do this? And I will stay on to coach a new executive through that first 6 months of that process. But it is about intentionality. And I mean, the reason I early on in the process talk about onboarding with boards, because they often forget that their job really begins after the new executive is hired and starts.
And I've heard of one organization recently that went through 2 executive directors in relatively quick succession, and had this exact question around onboarding. And I said, look, however you've done it before, don't do it again. Just don't do it. But what happened is there was a wonderful conversation on the staff side first of what do we need to inform this person about? What do we as staff need to essentially up-manage so that this person is fully prepared for everything that we do as staff, and they know what our kind of management style is going to be given all of those dynamics. And then the question with the board was all right, so how do we as a board then support and help and also create a greater boundary? Because part of their challenge was an organization, they didn't actually have a clear boundary between staff and board all the time. And they needed to essentially create a little bit of a vacuum for that executive to take and start owning that role really well. But it was a good conversation between board and staff, almost without an executive, to actually figure out where that space needed to sit. That was an unusual situation. You don't often have that. I think with NEEF, you guys have a good ED, and then think about, as that person's leaving, can that person help? with this new person, but B, is more of an advisor and a step back, and B, just sort of an ongoing dialogue to the new person without stepping in, and sort of owning that role. But how can you use the full range of people involved in the organization to really help the onboarding process? Because that will honestly often make or break people in the first 6 months.
Yeah.
Even if somebody is fabulous, if you don't give them the right support, they won't make it. So that level of intentionality, as Anthony, has to retain for at least the first 6 months to, I'd say, the first year of an executive's role. Really important, really important. And knowing that you all are really thinking about this as a board is a great place to be, so that you are prepared for that new executive to take that role. So I'm gonna give you all a second to think about any closing remarks you have. But I want to thank you all. I think this has been a really wonderful panel and wonderful conversation at that sort of nitty-gritty spot of like, all right, what do I do? Who am I looking for? And then how do I actually go about doing it? Because it's really important to find the match of both a partner, if you're looking for an executive, but also the internal culture of an organization and how you all are doing this internally. So thank you. I'm going to give you a moment to give a few remarks and then on to the next one.
Well, thank you all so much for having us today. This was a great conversation. I think it's really just important for us to be honest about all of these things, being honest about implicit bias, being honest about the parts of this conversation that make us uncomfortable is really where the answers are. I think if everyone in the room is saying the same thing and if everyone is happy, I think we're doing it wrong. And I think that if we can kind of reside in that space, if it doesn't start to feel uncomfortable, we're not really talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think if we can keep that in mind and develop the strength and the chutzpah to really get through that, I think that we've got a good start.
I want to thank Whitney again for inviting me, Green 2.0 and the Raven Group. I hope something has been said that can help you all. And also, I've learned a lot because this is a journey. We're never there yet. And if you think you're there, then there's a problem. So I would encourage you to go back and look. Like I said, I think the most important thing is ensuring that the internal culture of your organization is ready. That is a journey. It will involve many hard conversations. It'll involve a lot of training, skill building on emotional intelligence, and then putting those things into practice. How are we measuring these things over time? Because as I said in the beginning, you can build a pipeline all day and you can bring in as many diverse candidates as you want. However, if it's not a welcome or inclusive environment and you really are not trying to build a movement, then all of your work is in vain. So I hope that, I think we've all learned that, and thank you again.
Yeah, very similar to what my fellow panelists have already said. The only thing I'd add is not to just think of it internally, but externally as well. So the impact that you're trying to create is very connected to the people who help us create that impact. So keeping the mission, why it is mission critical, why it's important to our work, why it's not an optional approach, it's a required approach. We have already missed the train in a lot of ways, so how do we correct for the disparities that we've created in our movement, and really very intentionally give it the time and effort that it needs to correct it?
I have appreciated this conversation and enjoy, I do enjoy having this conversation. So I'm beginning this week having this conversation and ending the week with a group of search consultants. And I'm always the skunk at the garden party because I find myself in a context, the only person who's pushing on these issues. And so I will leave you with one piece of advice. If you're a board member or a senior staff member and you're hiring a search firm, don't be afraid to push your search firm and push them hard and ask them for the results in placing candidates of diverse backgrounds and get behind that. Just don't look at the numbers, but ask them, how do they make it happen? What networks can they reach out to? And have an intentional conversation before you engage with a search firm. I find myself often pushing the client to have these conversations. And so you should be, if you're serious about improving diversity in your organizations, push your search partner.
Well, thank you. You guys have been fabulous. The other closing remark I'll have is, we were talking about executive searches, but realize a lot of this can hold true for any hire. It's not just simply, you don't always have the luxury sometimes of hiring a search firm, but what are you doing internally to run around some of these practices of having a diverse candidate slate, of having a diverse interview panel, of having rubrics that really help to hopefully minimize some of those implicit biases throughout the process. You can do that in any hire. And so do it in every hire so that you have that level of commitment across the organization for every single person you're looking for, so that you do have, over time, an increasingly diverse workforce that will help you make these wonderful and incredibly important environmental decisions. So thank you, just simply. So yeah, come, take seats, get comfortable again. I get to introduce our next panel, which I'm very excited about. I'm going to largely introduce our moderator and let him introduce the rest of the crew. There's a lot of moving going on. I'll give you all a moment. All right. So come on up. Can I have Nasia Manson, Eric? Go ahead. Ollie. All right. I was going to let you introduce him, but I can do it either way. All right. You ready? Round two. You're going to require me to put on my big girl voice, which I will do. I should probably warn you, I'm a former middle school teacher. So just be forewarned. All right. So we have a wonderful next panel, really focused on, let's assume that you actually sort of get people of color, especially in those C-suite positions. And we have a wonderful set of leaders who both do that or are doing it right now. And I'm going to first introduce Brendan Mock, who is a staff writer at City Lab. And he's going to be the moderator for this panel. But then we have a really incredible set of people who have really been making an impact when it comes to this work, both on the environmental policy and other work that they've been putting in place, but also their leadership. And so I'm going to start from left to right. Vice Admiral Manson Brown. He's the former deputy administrator at NOAA, also a longtime Coast Guard, almost 40 years, I believe. But really, in part, why we brought the Vice Admiral is both his history in the environmental movement, but also his leadership in thinking about everything from the satellites to being on the water and actually being a member of the Coast Guard. And maybe this is me, but I think a lot of people don't always think of the Coast Guard as part of the environmental movement, but they are. And so think about all the permutations of the roles that people have. Next, the Honorable Ignacia Moreno. She was former Assistant Attorney General at the Department of Justice for the Environment and Natural Resources in the Obama administration. She now runs her own firm, but has a long and deep history as one of the few Latinas in this movement at a very senior level. As you know, she's also an NYU grad, so she has a fond place for NYU here as well. And then lastly, Eric Pica. Eric Pica is the president of the Friends of the Earth. He's been in the environmental movement for quite a long period of time, and one of the, I think, famous lobbyists under 40 when he was, at one point. But Eric, especially in the movement side of the House, and really thinking about the range when it comes to climate issues and justice, and really thinking about how you include a full range of people in both the problems and the solutions. So Brendan, I'll turn it over to you to get our panel started. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming out for this panel. I want to first thank Whitney for inviting me to participate in this discussion, and I would like to thank the Raven Group and the Green 2.0 for also bringing us here in New York to have this conversation. I would like to also shout out Danielle Dean, who I've seen in the back. She was the person who brought the Green 2.0 campaign to my attention when it first came off the ground, and I'm really excited to see and to hear that this campaign is still going strong years later. It's a monumental accomplishment, and you see that the work is still ongoing. Also would like to thank Robert Rabin as well for kind of kicking that off and for all of his work in leading this. As Mr. Rabin pointed out earlier this morning, the problem of the lack of diversity in the environmental movement, of course, is not unique to the environmental movement. It's also a nagging problem in the journalism world. And I'm a staff writer for citylab.com, which is a vertical under The Atlantic. And we actually are currently looking for a vice president. The Atlantic media is looking for a vice president to actually carry out this very kind of diversity work to kind of help bring better diversity and inclusion to the Atlantic staff. I know what some of you might be thinking, the irony that the magazine that brought you Ta-Nehisi Coates has a race problem. But it's, this is a problem that's pervasive throughout the media, and myself and a lot of writers of color at The Atlantic are working on kind of helping to build out the infrastructure for helping diversify The Atlantic. And part of what we want to talk about here today is that infrastructure that's being built through the Green 2.0 movement and the work that you all are doing if your respective organizations. Reading Dorcetta Taylor's most recent report, she points out in one of the top line findings that some of the infrastructure that's been built out, a lot of the organizations have not been utilizing it. They haven't been utilizing the GuideStar reporting tool to the most optimal ability. And so I want to talk about how do we get organizations, government agencies to use the infrastructure that's available. But before we get into that conversation, I want to give our panelists the opportunity to have their own opening remarks to set the discussion.
Thanks, Brendan. Good morning. Can you hear me? My name is Manson Brown. I'm the military guy here. I'm currently fully retired. I always tell people that I'm steeped in the joy of not working. For those of you that still have a day job, I can only hope that you attain the station in life that I am currently enjoying, because it's actually better than I thought it would be. But I still keep my hand in the game. And when Whitney invited me to join this august panel, it was an easy yes for me to say that. As she described, I spent 40 years in uniform with the U.S. Coast Guard. Before that, I was running the streets of Washington, D.C. You know, as I reflect back on that, as we talk about building power in the environmental movement, I remember as an African American in a predominantly black community in D.C. being told that the American dream was not for me. It's what poet Langston Hughes described as a dream deferred. That was sort of the script that many of us remember from the black community back in those days. The great irony for me is I used to bicycle around the city. I'd go down to the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument. I'd read some of the inscriptions on the wall. I was inspired by that. And so when it was my time to decide what to do, when I left home, I decided to join the U.S. Coast Guard. I wanted to pursue that dream against the odds. And so I joined the Coast Guard because they offered me a free education at the United States Coast Guard Academy, thinking I'd do my commitment and then leave. But I found an organization that was really committed to the ocean. And I was attracted to that because in my childhood experiences, one of my heroes was Jacques Cousteau. Some of you might remember the undersea world of Jacques Cousteau. I was a great fan of that, and I was interested in all things ocean and what I could do to preserve the ocean. You know, a lot of people didn't know what the Coast Guard did back then. Even today, a lot of people don't know. The Coast Guard essentially does three things. We protect people on the sea, we protect the nation from threats delivered from the sea, and we protect the sea itself. And it was that third mission, the environmental stewardship mission, in addition to life-saving, that had particular resonance with me. As an African American going through the academy, the organization was not really ready for me. And so I went through sort of this progression through my 40 years. The first 10 years or so, I was sort of my militant phase. I was fighting the system. The second third was an advocacy phase. We can do better was my main message to the organization. As I continued to promote in the system, the third phase was really a champion. We will do better. And so I ended my career with the Coast Guard, becoming the first African American to achieve 3-star rank. And that was really the expression of all of those battles and scars that me and many of my colleagues had gained through that progression. When I was done, I was ready to enter the joy of not working when President Obama's team called me and said, "We're not done with you yet." And I was asked to take on a political appointment at the Department of Commerce, working for Dr. Catherine Sullivan. There, I managed satellites, I managed data, I managed the process of taking the physics and converting it to useful forecasts. I managed the billion-dollar satellite programs. But more importantly, I worked with Kathy Sullivan to manage a really powerful campaign to transform the culture and climate of NOAA so that everybody felt safe, welcomed, nurtured, and professionally challenged. And it's from that perspective that I speak to you today.
Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you today to have this important conversation. I hope we're not just talking to ourselves and that, in fact, what we talk about today is going to really have an impact beyond this room, because I know there's a lot of commitment here. And I'd like to just thank Robert Rabin for conceiving Green 2.0, personally funding Green 2.0 at the beginning, bringing together enormous talent. I know somebody shouted out to Danielle Dean, who's here, but also to Whitney Tome, Erica West, Karen Driscoll, who were very involved in organizing the conference today. And there are many others at the Rabin Group working on Green 2.0. Also want to thank Ricky Revesz, who was my environmental law professor. He was a very, very young environmental law professor, brilliant. And it was in his environmental law course here at NYU that something went off in my head, and I decided I'm going to do environmental law. I found it. I came to law school because I wanted to do good. I wanted to make a difference in the world, and I just hadn't quite found what it was. I thought it was going to be criminal justice issues, and after a year at the Manhattan DA's office putting young people away, I thought this is not, I wasn't a lawyer yet, but I was on the teams. I thought this is not what I'm going to do with my life. I want to change people's lives for the better. And environmental law, that was it. What's more important than the planet? Clean water, clean land, clean air. Everything else seemed irrelevant to me if you couldn't get that right. I still believe we have to save the planet, and then of course ourselves. There are a lot of issues to work on. The first pushback I got were from fellow people of color. And they wanted to know, why aren't you working on immigration issues? Why aren't you working on labor issues? Why aren't you working on civil rights issues? And I would say, but I'm doing some of that, volunteer work. But this is my passion, environmental and natural resource protection. That is a white person's career. You're a traitor. I mean, I heard all this stuff. And I just plugged my ears and said, I'm not listening to you people. I'm going to go do this. And I have to say that for many, many years, it was a bit of a lonely walk. And I've been in the private sector, the public sector, and I've worked at a major company. So I've seen the issues from a lot of different angles. But always, if I'm in the private sector, I'm doing pro bono work. If I'm in the public sector, then I'm making it count. Always very focused on communities. And not only communities of color, but poor communities. I've traveled all over the nation to visit with these communities and First Americans. I've been on many reservations. And we do need to have not only engagement with communities. It's nice to sit in Washington and say, we're here to help you. We're going to come fix your problems, and you have no clue, really, what's going on out there and what people really need. I don't think only people of color can get what people of color need. But if we don't have diverse perspectives, and I mean broadly diverse, from people in communities of color, LGBTQ, tribal, gender, there's still few women in the big rooms. Still, amazingly, even though we've made more progress there. You need to bring in these perspectives. And not only at the beginning of the pipeline. Yeah, we look at all the numbers. Today, there are a lot more people in organizations than when I came out. But when you get to the top manager, that C-suite we keep talking about, and I'm going to put it in quote marks because, you know, the analog to the government is that front office. You don't see a lot of people of color or with diverse views. And almost anybody will tell you, I'm committed to diversity. And my question is, well, what have you done about that? Because there's a lot you can do about that. But it does matter who's sitting in the room and at the top, influencing the policy that we're going to pursue, both on substantive issues, like environmental justice, and on other issues, like how we're going to promote from within, even in hiring freeze. You can promote people, but you have to give everybody the same chance and information. And it can't be that my buddy who I go to lunch with is the only one who knows I've got a manager position coming up. And there's no deadline for when you apply, so we give it to this person, everybody gets an email. That's a real example. So I'm not going to say much more except the following. I was born in Cartagena, Colombia, and I'm an immigrant to this country. I came as a child, I didn't speak English. I grew up here in New York City. up in Washington Heights, which is north of Harlem, before Washington Heights was cool in a Broadway show, okay? So it didn't look like that. It looked like something else. And that's where my mother lives, and that's my home. And everywhere I've walked in my career, I'm either the only Latina, or if I'm lucky, one of two in a room. And even in the position that I was so honored to have President Obama nominate me for and the Senate confirm me for, I looked at the photos. I was only the fourth woman ever confirmed as head of the Environment Division at DOJ, and the day I took office was a 100-year anniversary of that division. The only person of color that I can tell from photos, if there's somebody else up there, there's somebody might be, but the only woman of color ever confirmed to head that division. 108 years now, it's the same story. So we need to do better on that, but it made a difference too. Two other photographs that I saw the first day I walked into the Justice Department in this administration, because I served there in the Clinton administration. As I went up to get my credentials at the security gate, I looked up above the guard, and there was a photo of President Barack Obama, and there was a photo of Attorney General Eric Holder, two African-American men looking down, and I'm getting goosebumps even now. At that moment, I felt choked up because I thought, this is going to be different, and it was. So I look forward to speaking with you about all of these important issues, and in particular, how we need to move and impact policy, because that really is what affects people's lives. And hopefully when my son is my age, we're not talking about having to get to diversity. Hopefully we will be there. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Eric Pica again, and I'm president of Friends of the Earth. And I'd like to thank Robert and Whitney and the Green 2.0 crew for pulling this together. And one of my most fulfilling moments in my career so far has been really systematizing a conversation that's happening with the leaders of the major environmental groups. We do meet together on a quarterly basis, but we never talked about diversity in our organizations as a cohort of CEOs or policies and campaigns that we're running, how to actually make them more inclusive. And it was conspiring with Robert and Danielle Dean, who's in the office, when I was heading this cohort, to actually create a conversation amongst the CEOs about how do we do this, how do we hold ourselves accountable to each other, and how do we have those uncomfortable conversations and share what are the things we're doing well, what are the things that we're not doing well at all, and how do we get better. And so, being able to help kind of create that conversation has been one of the highlights of the work I've been able to do. But at Friends of the Earth, I want to talk just briefly about our mission, because we had a question about, is this work, diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, is it mission critical? Friends of the Earth's mission is to champion a healthy and just world. And I will say for the first 40 years, we were really good at championing a healthy world, right? But if you start thinking about justice, and what does justice mean? Justice for whom? Then the question gets very interesting about whether or not we're doing our work. Because if we look at how we treat the environment, you cannot but look at how we treat our people, and what are the economic systems that allow us to devalue people, what are the social systems that allow us to devalue people, and what are the racial inequalities that allow us to devalue people. And so if you're trying to fix the environment and solve the climate issue, clean water issue, endangered species issue, which we're losing on those right now, you cannot but go down to the root issue, which is how we treat one another. And until we fix that, we won't have the solutions to solve the environment. And so at Friends of the Earth, kind of really grasping onto that justice part of our mission And I will say that that justice part of our mission is also informed by our international network, which has groups in 74 countries around the world. And I can tell you, half of our groups around the world aren't fighting for environment. They're fighting for basic rights. And in my own evolution and thinking, what they're fighting for in Nigeria, what they're fighting for in Colombia, what they're fighting for in Mexico or India or China is no different than what we're fighting for here in the United States. And so how we design our campaigns, how we run our advocacy, how we hire from within should all be impacted by this larger body of justice that we're trying to create. And so, I hope to have a really good conversation about how we change policy and how we change campaigns. But I will also put a question out to the panel and to the audiences. I am not sure that unless you make a conscious decision to change how you campaign on issues, that just being more diverse, equitable, inclusive, and justice, I don't think that it automatically means you're changing how you're doing your work. So I want to, I know that's the premise of this panel, but I want to make sure that we challenge and kind of chew on that because, my understanding, my experience with organizations, they have a cultural DNA that kind of builds upon itself, has its own momentum. And until you start thinking about that DNA and how to actually change it, you can add all that kind of the extra RNA across but it doesn't impact the DNA of the organization. So I want us to chew on that as well as we talk today.
So yeah, as we chew on that, fortunately there are things out there for us to chew on. I mean, there are tools, there are these campaigns such as Green 2.0. If my brother Mustafa was here, he would bring up EJ 2020 and all of these various plans that are available for government agencies and for NGOs to use in order to change the work and even change the culture and their DNA. So can you all just kind of talk about the challenge of actually getting agencies and NGOs to use the infrastructure that's out there to build the power?
Yeah, let me talk about it from a Coast Guard perspective. I talked about the progression that I went through. I was an angry young black man for the first 10 years of my career, and I was essentially shouting at the system without much effect. For survival reasons, I had a family by that time. I needed to make a paycheck. I polished my shouting. And so at some point, I guess I sounded a little more eloquent, and the system invited me to become a bit of an insider. That was at year 11. What we did once I became what we call in the military, the people in HR, we call them assignment officers. That is really a centroid of power in any military service, because those people manage the rules for who gets assigned, who gets promoted, and everything else that's important to a military corps. What we did was take a look at some of the policies that were in place and start dismantling the ones that posed barriers. I remember one particular policy. If you're an African American, it was assumed that you would not thrive by being assigned to particular areas of the country. It was those kinds of assumptions that really just frosted me. I remember another. It was assumed that if you were a single mother, you could not be recruited into the Coast Guard. That one frosted me. And so what we did was we removed those institutional barriers. And then it became a function of converting the leadership so that when people came into the service, they could thrive and move up the ladder. It took a lot of patience to get that process going, which really took me the rest of my career. But what I've noticed, and I think one of the biggest challenges we have with this, I think Ebony said it first in the earlier panel. Diversity and inclusion ebbs and flows with the perspective of top leadership. This is such an emotional issue with most organizations. If top leadership is not engaged, you're really just blowing smoke, quite frankly. And so what I noticed for much of my career is we would go through a sine wave effect with our focus. We would bring in lots of people of color and women, and then we would lose them. Congress would be on us to say, you're not as diverse as the nation you serve. And so we would ramp back up that sine wave and start all over again. We were getting nowhere. And I'll just stop there.
So I'll piggyback on what you said, because I do think it's important to have leadership. But it's not only the top leaders. You can have leadership at a line attorney level. I'll give you a little bit of background so you can understand some of the different roles. So I mentioned Attorney General Eric Holder as head of the Department of Justice, and I don't speak for the Department of Justice. These are my views. Even though I'm not there, I'll say that. He came in and decided that diversity and inclusion for the Department of Justice, and it's writ large, not only Main Justice, but the FBI, DEA, and all the other components, was going to be a mission-critical goal. And he set up a team of component heads. So it wasn't, just different bureaucrats, component heads. These were the people like me who were responsible and accountable for all of the different litigating divisions, et cetera. And as component heads, we met to come up with a strategy to bring diversity to the Department of Justice. Very heavy lift. This is I would say, an iconic agency of the government, sprawling agency of the government. And as a group, the Diversity Committee, we looked at a lot of different things, policies and procedures, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that we landed on that was very important and enduring is accountability. Because if you look across, a lot of efforts to bring people in. Same issues almost anywhere else, retention, promotion. Who's making it up the ranks? You see people coming in the door, you see people going out the door, but you don't see people staying and then making it all the way to the top. Why is it important to make it to the top? Because at some point, somebody's exercising prosecutorial discretion, deciding what it is we're going to focus on, how we're going to meet mission and use our resources. And you want to have diverse voices there. So when it came back to me, how am I going to make this happen in my division? I thought that, certainly you need the top down. You need to set the goals astride. This is what the leadership is interested in. But you need to work it from the bottom up. If you don't have that bottom up process matching the top down policy goal, it's not going to happen. And so in the Environment Division, we put together a committee that not only included lawyers, because we're not the only creatures on the planet, even at DOJ, there's a whole professional and administrative staff that sees stuff and knows things that we need to know about as we're working this up. And so we put together a committee that was made up of a cross-section of people. And the top managers were required to be on the committee. Everybody else, we put together young people and diversity across the board. The other thing we did, and I'm going to brag a little here because I got an award for it, and you're going to laugh in a minute as to why. The other thing we did was, you heard about the cultural assessments? We did something called a survey. But DOJ Pride, who's comprised of LGBTQ staff in the department writ large went to a number of the different component heads and asked if they could do a cultural assessment in our division. And everybody told me, say no. It's going to be bad news. We're not sure. We're scared of this. So in a brave, courageous act, I'm joking, I said yes. I said, I want to know. And other people were saying, what do we have to lose? We're so, it's the environment division. We're one of the friendliest components in the department. And I said, and that's a quote, I won't ascribe it to anybody, we're friendly, nice people. When I got the survey back, my jaw dropped at how LGBTQ staff in the environment division felt excluded, not heard, marginalized, et cetera, and I thought, how could this possibly be? Some people hadn't come out to their colleagues because they didn't know how their colleagues might react. And somebody mentioned all of the family photos on all the desks looked like, Tom Hanks movie, The Perfect Nuclear Family. And that was a wake-up call. And we took the survey and we worked through it. And it wasn't easy because nobody wants to point fingers and say, hey, you all are doing something wrong. But it was an opportunity to do something right. And I got an award for showing courage in having the survey done. And I say this because it is a tool. Hopefully later we'll get to talk about environmental justice, and I'll get to tell you how very young people can also affect things. And you don't only need political leadership, career line attorney leadership. We all can make a difference. Thank you.
In reflecting on your question, there's not a lack of tools right now. It's the lack of leadership. And so what Green 2.0 has done with the green community is said, here's the issues with pipeline. Here's how you solve it. Here are the issues with executive searches. Here's how you're going to solve it. Here are the issues. And so to me, it's not that we don't have the plans or we don't have the tools. It's really sitting down and demonstrating the leadership. What Friends of the Earth did over the last couple of years is that we said we need to diversify, get more diverse candidates on our board. And so my nominating committee said, we are not bringing any new board member on the board who is not a person of color. And we did that over the course of a couple of years, and we're better. We're not excelling, but we're getting better. At the staff level, we are tearing apart our hiring practices to make sure that the must needs versus the requirements versus what would be nice, we're very clear on that. I would say that the other piece is that when we're campaigning and actually trying to change the world through policy and the efforts, it's also kind of thinking through what are the incentives or disincentives and how are we measuring that success? Right, it used to be staff got rewarded and the organization gets rewarded by getting our name in the press. Well, that may not be the right way to talk to a community and work with a community in Memphis or to work with a community in the Gulf. That means we have to change our incentives around, our internal incentives, to make sure that we are incentivizing what's necessary, not what is nice to have. And that is a conversation, that's an ongoing conversation at the board level, at the staff level, within the rest of our community to make sure that we are actually measuring what we need to measure to be successful.
Great. Admiral Brown, you mentioned something that really stuck with me in my head. You talked about how the Coast Guard, for a time, they did not recruit single mothers, and I don't know if that was official policy or if it just happened to be the outcome, and then you found a way to kind of navigate around that because you recognize that as a problem in terms of diversifying the staff. I'm really curious to hear from all of you about the kinds of discoveries that you came upon in terms of how your agencies, how your organizations hired that had this kind of exclusivity built in, and what you did to kind of undo that.
Well, it really gets to Eric's cultural DNA challenge. I believe that leadership behavior in particular drives the culture and climate of an organization. I mean, people follow the example. People follow the school of thought of the leadership. And so what you need to do is you need to disrupt that a little bit. And sometimes it just takes having those crucial conversations. My conversation about single mothers went something like this. Why would you make an assumption of inability to serve for a single mother that's considering wearing the cloth of her nation? And I also showed them examples where life circumstance had created single mothers from women that were currently serving. And guess what? They were doing stellar work. So you shouldn't have a policy in place that could be perceived as exclusive by some. You should give people the opportunity. Now, this was years before people started talking about work life and giving employees the tools necessary to succeed in any organization. That's particularly important in a 24/7 paced military organization. So it's really just having that disruptive discussion and making them see it from the perspective that they haven't really considered. I remember a diversity champion trained me many years ago. His name was Sam Batansis. He said, the problem with many leaders is that people like to act normal. Managing diversity, inclusion, and equity requires you to think and act abnormally. And so you just need some vectors of disruption out there to really trigger that different thinking, if you will. And so one of the reasons I stayed in uniform for 40 years is it took me a while. You know, you crawl, you walk. But when you find your strategy, when you find your voice, it really presents incredible value to senior leaders. And I think that was really the vacuum that created opportunity for me for the rest of my Coast Guard career. And so to those of you that are women and people of color in the audience, particularly the younger folks, I know in many organizations you tend to suffer silently. I mean, that's shown in some of these cultural assessments. Find your voice. Your voice will be of value to the people around you, and particularly your leadership.
I have never found myself in a situation where there was a policy that said, expressly, we're not going to hire, let's say, single moms in the Coast Guard or anything like it. To the contrary, everywhere I've walked, there's been this great policy about we don't discriminate and we encourage diversity, equity, inclusion, et cetera. But getting from policy to reality is a whole nother ballgame. So I served at DOJ twice. You've asked about agencies. In 1994, in January, I came into the department for the first time as a special assistant, which is the lowest level human, political that you can get. So as a special assistant, I got to run, and I stayed 7 years, so I kind of grew up there to some extent. But as a special assistant, and even a junior counsel, and a woman of color, some people thought I was just invisible, right? I'm not really standing there, so I'm going to say something rotten about who we're going to hire here. So oftentimes I might be in the room, but people weren't thinking about what influence do I have? What am I going to do? So we're talking about, and I was always on the hiring committee because I was the only person of color in the front office. So I was always in the room listening to people talk about why they weren't going to hire some of the diverse candidates rather than why we were going to hire some of the diverse candidates. And at times I would raise my hand because my mother told me, if you're in the room, make it count. and I would ask questions, but I had no power to do anything other than to keep going to my boss and saying, but what about that? Anyway, the important thing is when you do have an opportunity to sit on a hiring committee. And one of the things we did was we went and looked at our hiring committee. They'd been there forever, decades. And we thought, hey, thank you for your service. Might be time to bring in new people. This is fast forward to when I came back to the department in 2009. Different situation because we had a lot of millennials and young people who were not going to take no for an answer. And if we wanted to keep those very brilliant, lovely people who we had brought in the door, they wanted to see diversity. It's like when I talk to my son about diversity, and he's half Latino. He's like, why are we arguing about this? Why wouldn't you have diverse people in the room? Exactly right. So the mindset also helps. I mean, leadership comes and goes, right? Different people get to sit in the chairs. But the real change happens when you have those young people on the hiring committee, when you have those people coming in. You're going to have a little bit of an army standing up, complaining, not just one individual saying, but that's not how we should be thinking about that. Now you have a mix of people on these hiring committees that will say the value. So cultural change takes time, but it is critically important to really making a difference in who gets to sit in these chairs.
The only thing I would add is that when I have failed at Friends of the Earth on this issue of diversity, inclusion, and equity is when I let somebody else worry about it. And so, we have tried this, and, again, we're not by far, we're still striving. We've had many false starts. And the false starts that I've had are when I thought I could start it, hand it off, come back to it after 3 or 4 months, come back, look at it, hand it back off again. And so I agree with everything that's been said. But from my perspective, like my greatest failures in this work has been when I thought, we all are busy, we all want to delegate, I'm in a position where I can delegate. I can't delegate this. And I can't delegate it down to the staff. I've got to own it, and I've got to push it up to the board so that they can own it. And that's my responsibility. And kind of every time we've started, and when I have not done that or followed through on that, that's when the process has slowed down or has failed, and we have to restart it. And undoing the cultural damage from doing a restart is almost harder than actually starting it the right way in the first place. Because you set up a whole set of expectations that you then have torn down, and then you have to rebuild them back up.
Just to follow on to something really important that Eric said about accountability, right? It's on your desk, you're responsible for it. A big change that we saw was when we built in, and this was department-wide, we built in critical elements for performance reviews that were tied to promotion of diversity. 3 new elements were put into the performance review for the most senior career managers and then the next level of manager. When I started getting, the ones that I had to approve and sign, when I started getting those and seeing what people were talking about that they had done the previous year to support their rating on diversity, I thought, okay, now we're talking. Because we didn't tell people what to do. We said, there were things you were going to be rated on, and then people individually started doing that because they knew they were personally accountable in the context of a performance appraisal. And that was a time when it made a difference. I think it was on everybody's desk as an individual to account for the work that they had done.
Another really important thing that you brought up, Eric, is this notion of failure. I I think sometimes what gets lost in these conversations is the fact that diversity is really hard work, right? And we're all gonna fail. Not every plan is going to work out the way it's supposed to. Not every hire is going to end up being the game changer. And so I'm really interested in hearing from each of you about any time during your tenures when something failed, and what did you learn from that to help improve moving forward?
How many hours do you have?
Sometimes you could try too hard. I remember early in the Coast Guard's diversity journey, it was sort of diversity at any cost. They would take women and people of color. We would take women and people of color and put them forward in successively more responsible positions and just assume that they would succeed. And there were some spectacular failures that occurred. Some occurred on CNN. And, it gets back to something you talked about. Diversity is just not putting women and people of color in positions of increasing responsibility. It's also building those support systems, and that's really the bottom-up portion of this. For many years, I was the only admiral of color in the 42-person Admiral Corps of the Coast Guard. And every time an issue of diversity and inclusion would come up, they would turn to me. We need to teach folks that white males, similar to what you just said, Eric, can own this issue. Most of what I did for my last 30 years in the Coast Guard was to teach white males that they could own this issue. Even when I got at NOAA, some of the white senior executives told me, I didn't grow up black in America. I don't know what it's like to walk in the shoes of a woman. I'm not equipped to manage this. And my response is, you're a leader, aren't you? Deal with it. This is what we call empathy. You communicate with your folks. You talk to them. You take some of those cultural assessments and you drill down and you try to develop insights about what your people are telling you. Daniel Goleman at Harvard wrote a book called Emotional Intelligence. I got to tell you, when I got to NOAA, it was sort of a out-of-body experience, particularly as a military guy. I was working with 12,000 engineers and scientists, really very smart people. My boss, the first American woman to walk in space. And it was a humbling experience for me, but because of the experiences that I had, I was able to bring value to a lot of these conversations. And so, to the white males in the room, you should own this, because you can own this. And there will be failures in your first attempts, but similar to that crawl, walk, run, at some point you're going to find your stride, and you're going to become a better leader as a result of it.
I think the hardest thing I've ever worked on has been diversity, promoting diversity and inclusion. And I've been doing it for many years. At first I thought it was true but you're the only one out there, and that maybe at the beginning there weren't a lot of people of color that were out there, nobody was seeing them. But that's not true anymore. There's a whole army of very senior, highly qualified people. You don't have to do this national search to go find them, they're right here. So I started thinking about, why aren't some of these tools really working in the long term? Why are we still fighting this fight? And I think it boils down to desire. If you have the desire and the will, you want to do it, it's going to get done. But a lot of the conversation in a polite way is that some people don't want to go there. And trying to find out why. Why don't you want to go there? Sometimes you hear things that are difficult to hear. Brown people or poor people or LGBTQ or women, fill in the blank, just not qualified for this, just don't have the right demeanor, That's one of my favorite. This person's too quiet. This person talks too much. It's like, which is it? Wait, I missed something here. The bottom line is that, like it or not, whether it's unconscious bias, I always try to think about what does that really mean, or whatever it is, there's a stopping point where somebody who's a decision maker is saying, not you, but you. I'm comfortable with you over here, and I'm not comfortable with you over there. There was a time when I thought, well, I'll just show them by example, right? I'm qualified, I can do this work, I'm handing in excellent stuff. I'm one human, and I'm going to run myself into the ground doing that. But yeah, I'm an ambassador. I think we all have that pressure, right? We want to perform, we want to do well, etc. So I think that there's something built in that we don't talk too much about. And those views, how do we change them? I'm thinking if after everything we've seen up until now, people's views aren't changing, what is it that we're going to have to do, really and truly? Because I'm always the one raising my hand and saying, what about the diversity and this and that, and what are we going to see from these candidates? And at some point it gets old, right? So I have also employed white male ambassadors to say, hey, I'm raising this issue at the meeting. I want you to back me up. Would you? Because I know. And in different jobs I've had, I've sent out a white male to go give the PowerPoint presentation on diversity, because maybe that's going to resonate. And I don't think we should have to do any of that, frankly. But we try every possible approach in the book, and it is difficult. And it's frustrating, but I don't think anybody here is giving up, so.
Admiral Brown, I had a chuckle inside. I'm thinking about your telling white men to own it and the pushback that you're getting about them not knowing black people. And I think the irony, we're all environmentalists in here, right? We study hundreds of species of flora and fauna and fish and animals, and then they say, but I don't know anything about black people. I would imagine it's the same process that they use to learn. Also, Ignacio, you said that the hardest thing you ever did was diversity work. I thought you were going to say the BP oil spill, but the diversity is harder than cleaning up the BP oil spill.
I usually say it differently, but I wanted to leave the Deepwater Horizon oil spill out of this, but I usually say, during my tenure, the hardest thing I ever worked on was diversity, even more than the Deepwater Horizon oil spill.
Wow.
That's how I usually say it, so you called me
That's
out.
really deep. Yeah. I mean, speaking of disasters, because I'm assuming that everyone on the panel has worked on an environmental disaster or two in the past few years. Talk about how valuable it meant to have people of color in leadership, making those calls, making those decisions as you all try to mitigate the disasters.
From a Coast Guard perspective, I'll go all the way back to the Haitian migration in the 80s, where we had thousands of Haitians fleeing their country, heading for the shores of Florida in boats that were unsurvivable, is probably the best description I could give you. About the same time, women started entering the organization in greater numbers. And in that particular case, a lot of the human interest stories that were showed on CNN and other places were about the empathy that those crews on those ships were showing to the Haitian refugees as they were pulling them off these boats. And that really is, I think, my best example of how diversity can add to the strength of the organizational mission. We went through the drug war in this country. The Coast Guard had a big part of that in the maritime domain. Having people in your organization that could speak Spanish was very helpful. And, almost overnight, the Hispanic members of our organization who were fluent in Spanish became the most popular people in the organization. So there are really cameos like that, I think, in any organization that show the power of diversity.
Yeah, I would go back to the hurricanes that hit the Gulf Coast, Katrina, like really trying to understand, everybody wanted to flood with resources and help, both advocacy help, monetary help. But unless you had a conversation with an on-the-ground entity or group, you had no idea where those resources could be most helpful, whether or not they were needed now, because what happens, within the first week or two after a disaster, there's this flood of resources, but there's no thinking of sustainability. Like, how do you sustain those resources? We had a Friends of the Earth, after the Haitian earthquake, we had a Friends of the Earth Haiti group. Another example, where, they weren't asking for like immediate aid. They were like, we're trying to stop the next big earthquake from creating the mudslides and destroying the property. And so how do we set up a tree planting program and an agroecology program that is seed saving and planting stuff so that the next major disaster we have doesn't take the toll that it's taken right now? And you don't get that information unless you're actually talking to the communities on the ground and actually trying to understand the context and then how to best deploy the resources that you can deploy.
When we were fielding the teams, for example, for Deepwater Horizon, we wanted to have, of course, the best attorneys in the division. And I was very happy to see that it was a very nice, diverse group of people who were considered the best attorneys to field the litigation. And the litigation that got a lot of attention was the civil case, the criminal case. But the division also defended a lot of challenges by industry in the suspension of drilling in the Gulf, and environmental groups regarding any number of things, the take of sea turtles with the burns and use of dispersants in the deep water column by EPA and other things. And we were defending all of those suits. And one time in particular, I won't mention what the litigation was, but it was a huge case. Everybody was watching. I got a phone call, and it's like, we would like somebody else on this, this case. And I said, no, so-and-so is the lead attorney, a Latino. And I said, and I am told he's the best at this. We want you to consider, and this went back and forth, and I held my ground, because in the normal course of our litigating these cases, that would be the person who would have the case. It was his case. And I felt that I needed to stand behind that person, because the minute I switch him, guess what? Nobody else is doing these cases that would in the normal course. Of course, I also called up the manager for this person. I said, you told me he was really great. Yes, he's really great. I said, I'm attending the moot for this, because ultimately I'm responsible for something like that. But he got the chance, and guess what? He was brilliant, super brilliant, showed off his stuff and moved on, as did, there were a lot of high visibility, diverse people. They didn't get that job because they were diverse. They got those opportunities for the top cases because they were the best. And that was something that we strived to do.
I don't think I remember seeing that part in the Deepwater Horizon movie, but maybe another one will come out telling what happened behind the scenes.
Not on this stuff.
I want to, take time to open the floor to questions from the audience.
Hi, Nicole Scott Harris, New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance. I actually have more so a comment than a question, and I would like to welcome your reflections. So I usually, when I have talks with community people, all different types of people, when I talk about California and the environmental landscape and environmental policy there, I usually say California is about 20 years ahead of the East Coast. And so respectfully, I feel like this conversation is a 20th century conversation that we're having 18 years into the 21st century. And government, broadly speaking, is an apparatus that's designed to maintain the status quo. So even when it wants changes that fit in a neat little box. So if you're looking at anything that's coming from this panel as in terms of as a model for what to do now, you're at least 20 years behind. The government is not going to be a model for revolution or for change or for meaningful structural. I don't know what the word to call it, but basically what we need right now. And to the Admiral's point about the American dream, my generation, I'm 33 years old, and so I'm at the front end of the millennial generation, is not buying into the American dream anymore. And they would rather live in a tiny house and work on a farm for the rest of their years than to stay in a system that's not reflecting the sense of urgency of the times.
You know, I agree with your comment. I've spent a third of my career in California, and a lot of my thinking about pushing organizations, governmental organizations, was really sort of formed by my experiences with progressive organizations in California. I actually married a girl from Berkeley. She also pushes me on these issues. I'll just be blunt. Government is a lumbering bureaucracy. You know, the job of government, and I'm no longer a government guy, I'm a citizen now, is to promote the general welfare. But that's supposed to do it in such a way as to empower the people. And you know, we don't want to promote too much. We want to give you some individuality in all of this. And so, you know, the three branches of government were designed with a particular intent. And it is hard. I'm sure Ignacia could back me up on this. Working in government is hard. It requires a lot of patience. It requires a lot of persistence. My reflection on your comment, though, is even in 2018, government is a source of access and a source of power for a lot of people in this country. And we need to get it right in government and catch up with our citizens in California. So like Ignacia, I'm not ready to give up on this.
I think that, you know, let me say it a different way. There are times I've thought of giving up. I'm not going to tell you no. But I think that if I had, it would be a disappointment to myself that, you know, I gave up. Because this is a fight and a struggle that we need to win. We owe it to ourselves and our kids and everybody that's to come, especially on environmental and natural resource issues. We add tremendous value. And you know, you make a really good point about how antiquated and slow. I mean, government is a behemoth. I've spent about half my career there, but I've never been there as a career person. I've been each time as a political person. And even in that opportunity, glacial, difficult, very, very difficult. You know, I've been following, of course, like everyone else, the Me Too conversation. And I've read some of those accounts, and I see how women felt, and I've thought, you know, those feelings seem really familiar sometimes when I think about being on the receiving end of, you know, some of the bias we've been talking about. It feels horrible. You don't have a voice. Who's going to hear you, believe you, etc. These are difficult things. On the other hand, I'm waiting for that tipping point moment. And I've got to tell you, I'm going to wait for that tipping point moment for my whole life, and I'm going to try to be one of the people trying to tip it over to that. Because just like we now will not tolerate sexual harassment and assault, etc., look at all the people who are no longer sitting in their powerful chair. We need to get to some point when you have, you know, these cases of intentional bias unconscious bias, whatever you want to call it, when you have somebody actually sitting there trying to exclude people on purpose, we have to be outraged, out them, and, remove them. I think we really need to be thinking about that tipping point so that it's not tolerated and not acceptable, period. It is taking a long time, but don't give up. We're going to get there. Hopefully, I won't be 90 or something by the time we do, but we'll get there. And it takes everybody in the room, including a lot of, the leaders at the organizations like Eric, who are really pushing to make a difference.
Nicole, I would look at your question differently. Like, what's actually happening right in California to push it 20 years ahead? And what I see in California right now is a very robust climate justice, environmental justice movement from the environmental perspective that basically said, we're tired of big traditional green environmental groups dictating policies that we had no right or no way in to influence. And so the evolution of the environmental movement in California is really based on these organizations and activists, people of color, saying, we are going to speak for ourselves and then create enough power within ourselves to begin to dictate the agenda for ourselves, right? And so to me, it's like, how do we take that lesson? That's been developing over the last 10 or 15 years, and it's really taken like a real foothold over the last 5. How do we replicate that lesson from California and put it in New York City or New York, put it in the Gulf, like wherever it needs to be? And so, like, what are those additional lessons we can pull from California? Why we think they are 20 years ahead, even though California has a wide income disparity, right? It has all the same issues that the rest of the country has, but they're doing something right at some level that I want to learn from and figure out how to replicate.
Hi, so my name is Arturo Garcia-Cosas. I'm the Environmental Program Officer at the New York Community Trust, and I have the honor of being one of the board members of color that Eric brought into Friends of the Earth recently.
I didn't know he was going to ask a question. So.
That's true, he did not know this. But I also had the honor of knowing Ignacia when I worked as a special assistant at EPA in the Clinton administration, and I worked for Romy Diaz, who was one of the highest ranking Latinos in the Clinton administration. And for Romy and for the agency, I worked on a national Hispanic outreach strategy. And that strategy had 4 pillars, and one of the pillars was recruitment, retention, and advancement. And as part of working on this, I did the number crunching, the necessary analytics and number crunching, and had a very sobering statistic that in the first 5 years, we were doing pretty well in recruitment. But in the first 5 years of someone's tenure at EPA, if it was a person of color, they were twice as likely to leave as a non-person of color. And I went, okay, that's crazy. So I actually started to do calls with people who had left in this time period, with people of color who had left that I could get in touch with. And fully a third to a half talked about feelings of isolation, feelings of that there was too much pressure on them, that if they made a mistake, they felt that mistake was amplified, much more important when they made it than a similar mistake from one of their colleagues. And that was part of the impetus for them leaving the agency. So I guess my question is, what kind of strategies do you think we should use, or agencies or big organizations should use, to address this issue? Admiral Brown talked about support systems. Like, what are the things that work in your estimation and in your many years working on this topic?
One of the things that I think is really important is, I'm trying to think how to say this, kind of growing your own stars, right? You have people come in the door, and there's always the orientation and the training, et cetera, for, let's say, young lawyers. That's all great, but then what happens after that? Maybe somebody gets assigned a mentor. Many of those relationships just don't work. People get busy. Somebody gets taken to lunch. We're done. What you need is a promoter. You need somebody who's going to support you. Oh, we brought you in. Why? Because you're brilliant and talented and you work hard, etc. So who's going to be your shepherd? Who's going to watch you grow? I was fortunate early in my career, in my first job, that I had people who were doing that. You know, by now you should be taking depositions. Let's put you in the queue. By now you should have done this kind of case or worked with an expert or whatever it was. Let me send you to training. Let me do this, etc. And that kind of sponsorship and then later promotion. What's the promotion? You're not in the room and somebody says, you know, Joe Schmo should get that case because he's really doing X, Y, Z and should be the one going and making the presentation, or whoever it is, right? Those promoters, those people with influence who are bringing you along and the people who are supporting your career are really critical. Because I mentor a lot of folks and I talk to people who are 7 years, 8 years out, and no one's minding them, shepherding them on the path to success. Why is that important? Because the day that that position comes up for promotion, that's usually the day that a lot of people of color hear for the first time, oh, but you haven't done an expert deposition. Oh, but you haven't argued a motion, or you haven't been in court. And it's like, but why not? Is it somebody with ability but not with knowledge about what you need to do to succeed? So we need to get the people who are in those senior positions to bring our folks along. So now you don't have to do, again, the national search. You have a star right here who's in the queue and in line to be moving up. And we all, everybody here in the room, if we're committed to this, we need to do better. Look around wherever you work. Who are you going to bring along and show the ropes to, right? Because we're here because we made a lot of mistakes along the way, too. You know, fits and starts and whatnots. And you learn from that, but nothing better than somebody who's, you know, just watching out for you.
Yeah, my response, and it's a great question. I think it was Robert that talked about the emotional component of this diversity and inclusion work. When you've got cameos that show that portions of your workforce are suffering silently, you need to lift the veil off that and give it some transparency. You can't include the attribution because people need to be able to speak freely in an anonymous setting. But one of the things I did at NOAA when I arrived there is I hijacked the Senior Executive Conference. We pulled together 120 senior executives. Kathy kicked it off. She basically said, we're going to spend 2 days talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. She started by talking about her experiences as being one of the first 6 women brought into the astronaut corps. Quite frankly, after her story, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. That set an emotional connection for the rest of the conference, and we spent 2 days talking about what can we as a group of senior leaders do to prevent that reoccurrence within our workforce. I follow Kathy by taking the latest cultural assessment and unpacking it and putting up some of the statements from members of our workforce, people of color, women, and majority males, illustrating how people felt in the organization, those that were suffering silently, and illustrating how people who were expressing their own biases around the water cooler felt about women and people of color. That was an aha moment. But that transparency really created a sense of concern, a sense of rage within those 120 folks. And each of them walked away by signing a commitment to move the needle forward. This is how you change organizational and cultural DNA. Is you galvanize the leadership, make it an emotional issue for them, tell them that there are people in their workforce that are suffering silently, and if they don't do something about it, the organization can never be what it's designed to be. The last thing I did with my presentation is I took the results of the federal morale happiness audit. And I showed where we were, and you know, we're always leading the government average. And I showed where NASA was. NASA for the last few years has been stratospheric, 20 points higher than the average. And I said, why can't we be NASA? And so I put up a bumper sticker, Go NOAA Beat NASA. And that became sort of the emotional challenge for this issue as we move forward. That's what you got to do. That was an abnormal conference, but it got people thinking and put them in the right cognitive mindset to move this issue forward. And I'm proud to say, you know, it's been the better part of a year since I left NOAA. The passion of those senior executives that remain continues.
So, unfortunately, I think we only have time for one more question, and then we're going to have the panelists give their closing remarks. So I'm sorry, I know there are a lot of people online, but I believe all of the panelists will be available right out, you know, in the reception afterwards for people to speak with them. So please.
Thank you. I want to suggest, and it's too late perhaps to have the discussion, diversity is not a problem in the environmental movement. The problem is inclusion. The diversity is in communities all over the country, strong organizations that are affecting local, state, and national change. To keep it short, I would remind you that 30 years ago this year, the environmental justice movement, led by the Gulf Coast Tennis Association in New Orleans and the Southwest Organizing Project in Albuquerque, sent letters to all of the large environmental organizations saying, you don't talk to us, we'll work with you, but you've got to listen. White men don't often listen, and particularly then, and I can speak personally, I had to learn the listening process, as my wife has also noted, that the need is now to get some discussions going. I was president of a foundation that was working with these people at the time. The Nationals' response to that was to come to me and say, Sierra Club, would you give us $350,000 to do environmental justice work? And I said, well, if the EJ communities want your help, have them write me a letter and we'll fund it directly. And we were funding most of the organizations at the time. This is the same situation. It hasn't changed. Getting heads of large organizations who are persons of color is a great idea, but it doesn't change the cultures. The board members, and no disrespect to your board, and Friends of the Earth was always somewhat different, were people who were not in contact and interested with these. And we just have to recognize that there's that same block of form of discrimination, what you will. And that's another conference, I think. And the fact that 10 years hasn't changed the situation is 30 years rather, is very distressing.
I'm sorry, we have to go to the closing remarks of our panelists. So you all want to go ahead and take it from there?
Yeah, I want to thank the leadership for the opportunity to come join you today. You know, as I reflect on building power in the environmental movement, let me just share this perspective from a 40-year member of the United States Coast Guard. You know, I think subliminally I understood from an early age that I was part of this movement, but that was not a conscious thought as I went through the various stages of my development in the Coast Guard. You know, environmental stewardship is an important mission, but I never saw the work that I was doing in the Coast Guard as part of the broader movement. I think as we think about aligning all of the efforts within this movement, there are some non-traditional elements out there like the U.S. Coast Guard that you should consider pulling in. And I think the more we sort of align the vectors all moving towards the same strategic direction, the more power that we can seize. The last thought I had is, you know, I was an assistant secretary. I testified on Capitol Hill. One of the power centers in our nation continues, despite their approval rating, to be the United States Congress. And I looked at the various caucuses to see where environment is reflected. And quite frankly, it wasn't as strong as I thought it would have been. And so I think that's another power center that we should develop a strategy to go build some inroads towards. Again, I want to thank you for the opportunity. I am going to remain afterwards to answer any questions that may linger.
Thank you once again to Robert Rabin, Ricky Revesz, and especially Whitney Tome for hosting this conference, guiding the conversation. It's been wonderful sitting with my fellow panelists and our moderator. What I will leave you with is to say that maybe it's stubbornness on my part, but I'm not going to give up. I do have a vision for what it can be like, and I know that it's a heavy lift. As I hear the news and go about my day, sometimes I think we're going backward. But again, that stubbornness says, no, we're going to move forward. But we're going to need everybody in the room. And I mean all views. I want to pull the veil back. I want to know what other people are thinking. Positive, negative, because that's how we're going to keep moving forward. We need to continue to have honest conversations, tools, strategies, all of it. We have to have a will and a desire to see a different world where we are included. I agree, the inclusion part is a very important part of this, but inclusion as a full partner. It's critically, critically important that we bring all of the resources and voices to this. So again, thank you very much for the invitation. I hope that we continue having this conversation. I've learned a lot today. And I will look forward as well to speaking with those of you who have any questions during the break. Thank you.
And I will again thank Robert and Whitney and Danielle preceding for pulling this together. I was struck by the last comment. I feel like it needs a response, because where I come from is you should be judging us both by what we're doing internally, but then what is the actual change that we're trying to create on the ground. And so and I keep on having this interaction in Copenhagen when I was at the COP 15 meeting. I think it was 15, there's so many of them, where I was standing in solidarity with our African colleagues because we were opposing the Copenhagen Agreement. And we were saying 1 degree, 1 Africa, 2 degrees suicide. And what that meant is that everybody negotiating the Copenhagen Accord forgot that you have a continent, a whole continent, that at 2 degrees will become so inhospitable that people will die. And those people were in the room talking about advocating, asking, I want to say begging and pleading, because that's where it was at, for the resources to help save their continent, right? And so when I say judge us by what we do, we can do all this diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice work internally. But if it doesn't change the policies that we're trying to advocate for, if it doesn't change the positions that we are holding, if it doesn't expand what we include as an environmental issue, if it fails to do that, then this process has failed the environmental community and has failed this larger community, and it's failed the country, and it's ultimately failed our mission to protect the environment and create a healthy and just world. So if you take it from anything out of this meeting, judge us by what we do and what we say publicly, because that will be what you will hold us accountable for, and that's when you know that the real change is taking root in our organizations. And for those who are afraid of that change, I can list to the Keystone XL pipeline fight that was led by indigenous peoples and ranchers. the Dakota Access Pipeline fight, led by indigenous peoples. The fight in California on cap and trade and against cap and trade to actually create a more just climate policy, led by people of color, climate justice, and environmental justice community. So if we as an environmental community are afraid of letting these voices speak for themselves and provide them resources to be able to elevate them, if we're afraid of the results that we're getting, we're just tapping the potential here, then we're having the wrong conversation right now. Thank you.
That's our panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. Yeah, please take a seat. I know in between, like, you've got me, 2 other people, and then you can do lunch, okay? We'll make it brief. Thank you so much. That was a really incredible panel. Thank you. And for the questions. I'm going to give a brief introduction to a wonderful member of our working group, Donna Hope, who used to work for the New York City Mayor's Office of Sustainability. And now Donna really serves as a consultant and does it on a wide-ranging set of issues. Everything from, air quality to water quality, infrastructure, hydraulic modeling, groundwater, soil remediation, food equity, urban farming, energy efficiency policy. She's like a one-woman jack of all trades. But I'm going to bring her up here to help introduce our closing speaker. Donna, thank you so much for coming to join us.
Thank you, Whitney. As she mentioned, I am a Jill of all trades, if you will. But I'm really happy to introduce our final speaker because I had a stint also as a policy advisor in the Mayor's Office of Sustainability not that long ago. It doesn't seem that long ago, but I guess it was 5-6 years ago now. And at the same time, I was just starting as a Green 2.0 advisor and very proud. And I went in boasting about this new initiative that I was involved with to advance diversity, equity, inclusion in the environmental fields. And I was met with a lukewarm response. And I was surprised by this. And I thought, well, maybe it's because we live in New York City, we're naturally diverse, we have every spectrum of diversity reflected in our office, but that wasn't necessarily intentional. We didn't necessarily put that out as a priority in our office. And I was surprised and disheartened even with the lukewarm response that I got when I shared that I was part of this initiative. So I'm particularly happy that we have some new leadership in the Office of Sustainability that has prioritized diversity, equity, inclusion. And now I'll go right to his bio. Mark Chambers is an urbanist, an architect, and the Director of Sustainability for Mayor Bill de Blasio in the city of New York. In this role, he leads the development of policies and programs that enhance the near-term and long-term sustainability of New York City, as outlined in One New York, the Plan for a Strong and Just City. I highly recommend you read it. Mark served on the board of directors of the NYC Energy Efficiency Corporation, NYSEC, and the Building Energy Exchange. Most recently, Mark served as the Director of Sustainability and Energy for the government of the District of Columbia, where he led an interdisciplinary team to creatively manage energy supply and demand, as well as water and waste resource conservation efforts across Washington, D.C.'s municipal portfolio of buildings and properties. He holds a graduate degree in public policy and management, and an undergraduate degree in architecture, both from Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. He lives in Washington Heights with his wife and 2 children. And without further ado, and last but certainly not least, Mark Chambers.
Thank you.
Good morning. Let me get myself settled here for a second here. So thank you, Donna, for the introduction, and thank you to of course, to the Green 2.0 team for all you do to shine a bright light on how much the environmental movement has to benefit from diverse voices in leadership. And as well as, and I think this is an important point, acknowledging that like every other systemic problem, change and representation in the realm of environmental advocacy and sustainable development is not going to happen by accident. It's not. It's going to take a lot of hard work and diligent effort from dedicated people, like a lot of you, sharing tools and sharing stories, like we heard today. So I'm extremely excited to be able to be a part of this and to be able to contribute this morning. I got to tell you a quick story, and just because it was on my mind and I was talking with someone about this a day or two ago. I sit on a lot of boards as part of this this role and advisory committees, and for a lot of environmental organizations. So a little while ago, I got asked to be on the board, and I go to my first meeting, and this relevant and fairly high-functioning organization, enough to have a board of 15 to 20 people or so, and I'm the only person in the room. Spoiler alert, shocker. So I do my thing at the meeting, and I go back to my office, and all I kept thinking about when I got back to my office was one of the first boards that I was ever a part of. It was in I think 2008 in Washington D.C., and I was working for an architect at the time who was kind of a mentor, Marshall E. Purnell, and he at that time had been elected to be the first African-American president of the American Institute of Architects, the national president. And subsequently, he asked me to be to sit on the Strategic Initiatives Board for Sustainability for AIA. And I'll never forget, I was on this call, like kind of webinar with the other kind of board members. We're going through a deck for the national platform. And one of those images pops up in the deck, and it's like one of those images that is kind of way over the top, like super tree hugger-ish, where it's like there's like these little kids, and they're like holding soil and like a sapling, and they have there's like their like proud parents are behind them, and there's a like grandparents in the background. And everyone on the call is like, oh my gosh, this is an amazing photo, and this is great, I can see myself in this image, and like I feel like it speaks to people of all different ages, and it's really gonna kind of be really impactful when we're delivering this deck. And it dawned on me like during that time, it's like, oh, this is why I'm on this call. And I was like, so let's go back a slide. And so I tell the folks, I'm like, hey, it'd be awesome if we had like a slightly more diverse pick in this deck. And everyone's like, oh, sure, that makes sense. They all agreed, and we moved on. It wasn't something in which they were opposed to, they just didn't think of it. It didn't collectively pop into their minds that this kind of photo could quickly reinforce exclusionary messages about, to others about their role in the climate movement. A bias that says, this is the future, and you're not a part of it. So I flash back, and I'm back in my office, and I'm going through kind of my post-board meeting emotions, and I pen a quick email to the team, at least to the folks that were on the nominating committee of this board. And I quickly say, I asked them, can you please consider in the future maybe selecting more diverse board members? I think it'd be a great thing. So I get an email back, and agreeing that this is a priority, thanking me for my note, and asking if I had some suggestions on who to nominate and who should be on the board, and I should send them over. And I'll tell you why this response in particular annoyed me. The case for diversity in businesses has long been litigated and proven. It is competitively advantageous, point blank. Diversity builds beneficial networks. Diverse leadership, of course, as we talked about it today, brings the right skills to bear at the right time for a lot of organizations. It provides better insight into consumers and stakeholders. It is a no-brainer writ large for organizations that are involved in any serious recruitment. So 10 years ago, I probably would have been more helpful. I would have I don't know, like try to take some time and come up with like suggestions or recommendations, places like listservs and user groups where they can reach out to. But, it's 2018. I have a lot of stuff going on. And I didn't sign up to be on the nomination committee. You did. So you go find diverse candidates. You go operate in the best interest of our organization, by seeking out candidates that actually make us stronger. Because it can't be the sole responsibility of men and women of color to bear the full burden of self-recruiting leadership. We're out here. We're super smart. We're incredibly committed and passionate in this climate fight, so stop excluding us. And my work is going to be to hold you accountable to that. So I say all that to say is that while I think that there's a lot of effort and a lot of need to be able to set the benchmark and know that where we're trying to get to, I think it's particularly important right here and right now for us to hold people and organizations accountable to their values. It's something that we are uniquely positioned to do. And so as Chief Sustainability Officer for New York City, I have the distinct honor of representing not only Mayor de Blasio and all of you in the 8.5 million residents of this great American city, as we chart this sustainable course forward for our 5 boroughs and, to be honest, for our shared planet. And although we live in very, let's call them strange times, the dystopian consequences of which will play themselves out for several generations, we also live in very exciting times where technology and innovation and automation are opening doors that make it possible for environmental and climate science to truly leap forward and determine the future of our cities in a way that is still directly driven and impacted by the work that we all do every day. But given my earlier rant about the absence of a lot of intentional recruiting, one could argue that I'm really not supposed to be here, right? I must be an anomaly or like some, glitch in the matrix, like some program running against its native operating system. Seriously, like me and my luxurious beard and unapologetic blackness should not be here. I should have been filtered out by the system and never appointed by the mayor for this position. But I will say this, an important distinction is that when Mayor de Blasio came into office 4 years ago, he was very clear on his intent around how he was going to set up his administration. His administration, his cabinet in particular, would reflect the city that we represent. In his first 59 appointments, 30.5% were black, I think 13.5% were Latino, 10% were Asian, 51% of which were women. Now, mind you, this was not a perfect mirror of the city, but, and everyone acknowledged that at the time. I think what it did, though, is that it made it clear that a successful mantle of governance in this city, at its core, would seek out the best and brightest minds, and they would also reflect and look like the populations we serve. It's not novel. It makes perfect sense. He changed the narrative. He sent a clear message that we are stronger together, and that intentional inclusion would be the norm. And it mattered. So, it meant that when my predecessor left this position and the administration began, casting a net to be able to find candidates that would direct sustainability for the city, they were able to better articulate the needs for this role as a part of a progressive metropolitan global center. And those needs are vibrant and nuanced, as vibrant and nuanced as New York. Because the challenges that we face, from a changing climate in particular, are definitely nuanced and complex and nonlinear. We need more diverse and interdisciplinary voices in the room to help solve these problems, period. As an environmental leader, you need to push the narrative relentlessly in your organizations. You have to remind those that you have to remind people in your care that this is critical to their success, and it's consistent with your values of service. And everything around us is just changing so rapidly, and we know we can't be focused solely on stewardship of places any longer. We have to actually be stewards of the people that inhabit those places. And our processes and our policies really need to reflect that. Part of my responsibility now, I'm gonna take another sip of this coffee. Part of my responsibility now is to embed this great existential work into our city services, and to find new and creative ways to meet residents where they are. And honestly, to help unlock their potential to contribute to this work. And I'll tell you kind of what that means. It's not just me telling you to, and telling you and your stakeholders that you need to go and, grow trees and then hug them. It's me acknowledging that for a number of reasons, those that you serve may not be able to prioritize working on climate. Or maybe they have been structurally or historically excluded from the conversation altogether. So meeting this challenge will necessarily require bringing more people into the conversation. And actually not just more people, it actually is gonna require all the people. It's that bad. So those people need to bring their skills and bend their skills and passions towards this generational effort. So, I think recapping, and I know I've gone a lot of different places with this, but I think one, we have to hold people accountable. We are more connected now than ever before, and leaders are reachable. So push them to do better. Tweet at them, hashtag delete them if you need to. We need to develop allies that can really stress the intersectionality of this work and on inclusion and diversity, as well as other elements of social and environmental justice. We need to let them know that when you arrange a panel, this is not an uncommon scenario for me, to talk about species level crisis, and it's only kind of chaired and filled by gray-haired white dudes, they're sending a very stark message. And they need to work harder to make sure that we are correctly implementing a solution. It's actually not that hard, but it requires everyone to pay attention. Two, I think we need to make our organizations more accessible. Environmental organizations in particular, they state that one of the biggest challenges or barriers to hiring minorities and people of color is the lack of applications. But we have to unpack what that means. If people of color can't envision themselves as part of the solution and part of your organization, it's partly because we are either ignoring them altogether, or again, we're sending a message that this organization, this company, this opportunity is not for them. So we need to use every internship opportunity, use every speaking opportunity, every press quote to reinforce this narrative of inclusion. There are lots of opportunities, and we need to start taking them more intentionally. We need to put ourselves in spaces that communicate and underscore not just our support for a diverse workforce, but actually our understanding of its need. Our actions truly need to reflect, the change that we're trying to create. So I think lastly, a point that I wanted to make, it's also important, and this doesn't just apply to this group in this setting, in this conversation, but I think it applies to a larger sense of accountability, accessibility, and to the comment earlier, I think acknowledging that we are in a very disruptive age, and that's okay. I think that we actually do need to break down some of the mantles that have made it difficult for us to communicate in the past. And we need to stay engaged with the communities and individuals that we serve. What motivates them, what frustrates them, how and when, and where do they mobilize and communicate, and what does, their mission or your mission or your actions that you're asking them to take, what does it mean in the context of their day-to-day lives? Solutions cannot exist in a vacuum, and I don't think we have the space to allow for them anymore. We have to meet people where they are. And in doing so, we not only empower stakeholders by unlocking their diverse potential, but we draw a bright line to a sustainable future that is inherently more fair, more inclusive, and honestly more prepared to successfully meet the profound challenges ahead. That's all I got. Thank you.
So thank you. Thank you all so much for taking so much of your day and your time. I'm hoping you learned a lot. Hopefully you're walking away with a lot of things, but the one couple of things I will leave you with is go from intent to action. It's not just about caring about this, it's about doing it. What are you going to do the rest of today and tomorrow and the next day to help change this? 2, I love Mark's comment. Maybe we're actually going to change the native program. That's the paradigm shift, which is how do we actually totally transform this movement to be inclusive of all? Full stop. And what are you going to do to help make that happen? And then lastly, it is mission critical. It's so important for this entire environmental movement, for the things that we care about, clean air, clean water, healthy food, to be a part of everybody's life, and for us to put people at the center of that movement. And lastly, I want to thank a collection of people. First, Richard Revesz, thank you for you and your incredible team to help us pull this together. You're amazing. Dina, Derek, and Ileana, thank you so much. You guys have been an incredible partner with this. The Green 2.0 team, who makes things work beautifully for me, so thank you all. Erica, Karen, Oliver, Alex, and Ryan, thank you so much for helping us to pull this together. And to our incredible speakers, thank you all so much for bringing your talents, efforts, and thoughts to this. It's incredible. Go out and do this even better next time. All right, thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day.